This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Nuclear is Not the Solution by M.V. Ramana. The climate crisis has propelled nuclear energy back into fashion, with proponents calling it the technology of the future. In Nuclear is Not the Solution, professor and author M.V. Ramana demonstrates why this sort of thinking is not only naive, but dangerous. Ramana explores the costs, both environmental and financial, involved in the production of nuclear energy, and examines why governments and private corporations continue to support it anyway. Naomi Klein describes the book as a devastatingly convincing case against the dangerous distractions of nuclear energy, a major contribution destined to change countless minds. Listeners can buy Nuclear is Not the Solution directly from versobooks.com and save 40% at checkout using discount code DIG. That's all caps, D-I-G. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the first of what will be, to no one's surprise, a multi-part, though only a two-part, epilogue to our voluminous series Thawra, an extensive investigation into 20th century Arab politics with historian Abdelrazak Takriti. Thawra is Arabic for revolution. It's a word that contains historical multitudes, diverse political radicalisms and revolts that have swept across Arab lands over the past century. We completed the 16th and final episode of Thawra in 1982 as Israel invaded Lebanon and laid siege to Beirut in a successful effort to expel the Palestinian Revolution from its headquarters. In this first part of the epilogue, we continue onward from that moment toward the present, but at a much higher level of abstraction, with far less narrative detail. We trace the PLO's moves as it relocates to Tunis and heads down the path to the Oslo Accords, even as the heart of the struggle relocates from frontline states like Lebanon to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, where Palestinians under direct Israeli occupation launched the First Intifada. But in Palestine and across the region, the sort of secular left-wing and nationalist parties whose stories we have dedicated Thawra to telling were being eclipsed by conservative Islamic religious parties. That includes Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Muslim Brotherhood across the region. This was not just mass political phenomena, but a turn that had powerful state backers. Saudi Arabian King Faisal and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat played leading roles in mobilizing religious reaction as part of a project to supplant and suppress the secular left. The process was a global one. The Gulf states and the United States, more tightly linked than ever due to the booming circuit of oil exports and investments in Wall Street, encouraged an even more radically conservative religious movement in Afghanistan, funding religious extremists to fight the Soviet invasion, including a young, wealthy Saudi man named Osama bin Laden. In Iran, the 1979 Islamic Revolution not only toppled the Shah, a pillar of American power in the region, but also catalyzed and supercharged a new politics of religiously conservative anti-imperialism that reshaped the region, especially, but not only, for Shia Muslims. In Lebanon, Hezbollah emerged as the dominant Shia political force, displacing the communists and Lebanese national movement as leader of the resistance to the Israeli occupation of the country's south. The Lebanese Civil War, which took a far more generally sectarian turn after the PLO's exit, formally ended in 1990. The Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon would only end in 2000, after Hezbollah successfully drove them out. Meanwhile, Iraq responded to Khomeini's attempts to export the Islamic Revolution to Iraq's southern region by reasserting its claim to borderlands that it had previously relinquished to Iran in the 1975 Algiers Accord. The result was the devastatingly bloody Iran-Iraq War, a war between two nominally anti-imperialist pro-Palestinian powers, perfectly encapsulating the tragedy engulfing revolutionary projects across the Middle East. Iraq was backed by both the Soviet Union and the Western powers, including the United States, which was actually also playing the other side of the war. The end of that war, which resulted in the death of more than 1 million people and left both sides economically exhausted, was followed by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and then by the first U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. That U.S.-led war marked a qualitative shift in a long-running buildup of U.S. military power in the region, laying the groundwork for a new Middle Eastern security geography unlike anything that Nasser could have imagined when he was fighting the Baghdad military pact in the 1950s. According to an Intercept investigation, there are an estimated 63 U.S. bases, garrisons, and shared facilities across the region. In Bahrain, Egypt, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. I want to emphasize that the First Gulf War marked so many profound shifts. The Soviet Union was collapsing, Islamic religious parties were taking the place of the secular nationalist left, and a triumphant United States had declared a unipolar New World Order. But George H.W. Bush's New World Order was a Pyrrhic victory that paved the way to 9/11, the War on Terror, the Second Intifada, the invasion of Afghanistan, the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq, Hezbollah's victory over Israel in 2006, the remarkable blooming of the Arab Spring, the turn to armed civil conflict, October 7th, and then, now, the Gaza genocide. All subjects we'll discuss in our second and final epilogue. We end this episode by discussing the PLO's move toward the Oslo Accords, a political tragedy that Edward Said once called an instrument of Palestinian surrender, a Palestinian Versailles. But the surrender was far from total, and the defeat of the PLO's armed struggle opened a vacuum for armed resistance, a struggle now taken up by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, two organizations that, 3 decades later, remain on the scene and at the bleeding edge of a new, more religiously oriented Palestinian national leadership. In this sense, and countless others we'll discuss over the next few hours, the defeats and retreats of left-wing, secular, nationalist revolution continue to be prime events that define regional politics, and therefore global politics, very much up through the present day. Before we get started, these final 2 episodes, our 2-part epilogue, conclude Thawra, our nearly 40-hour exploration and examination of 20th century Arab politics. It's unlike anything we've ever done, and it's also unlike any other historical resource on the history of the Arab East. There's nothing else like it. We do everything we do at The Dig in the service of our political education mission, giving people working to transform the world, like you, the analysis you need to understand it. And we can only do that because listeners like you support us at patreon.com/thedig with a monthly or annual donation. We paywall absolutely nothing so that everyone can listen. And it's you listeners who voluntarily donate who make that possible. You'll get our newsletter by email. We have gifts to send you in the mail, like books, tote bags, coffee mugs. But the real reason we want you to contribute is that we very, very much depend upon your support. That's patreon.com/thedig. There's a link in the show notes. Click it. Thanks. And here's Abdelrazak Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University, a scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements. He's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website. Let's begin this epilogue where we left off in 1982 in the wake of the PLO evacuation of Beirut, an evacuation that took place under the tremendous pressure of a murderous Israeli siege imposed upon the city in an ultimately successful effort to expel the Palestinian Revolution from its headquarters. And that evacuation, of course, was followed by the large-scale joint Israeli phalangist massacres of Palestinian and poor Lebanese Shia refugees in Sabra and Shatila. What path did the Palestinian struggle take in the following years leading up to the Oslo Accords as the PLO made a new headquarters in Tunis, where it came under Israeli Air Force attack, and then with the First Intifada taking off, a mass popular uprising and civil resistance movement that began in 1987. In other words, what sort of shift did 1982 mark? A period that, among other things, put the PLO on this path toward renouncing armed struggle a decade later.
So, Daniel, the attack on the PLO in 1982 was, of course, an attack on the Palestinian people as a whole. It was designed to destroy the achievements of that people that had taken place during the golden years of the Palestinian Revolution, the years that constituted the response to the defeat of the 1967 war. So during those years, the PLO essentially embodied the popular sovereignty of the Palestinian people. Even though it did not have territorial sovereignty in any part of Palestine, it did represent the will of the people, including largest section of the people, which is those that were living in the Shatat, those that had been expelled from their homes and villages in 1948 and after 1967 as well. So what you had was an assault on that principle of the Palestinian people having representation, having popular will. And that includes, by the way, the civic infrastructure. It includes the educational infrastructure. And it also, of course, included the diplomatic and political apparatuses, in addition to the military capacity. For people in this world to have a successful national liberation struggle, they need to be able, of course, to have a territorial base out of which to wage that struggle. Now, inside Palestine, that's always been a struggle because Palestine is very small. Palestine is heavily monitored. Palestine is under the thumb of a very violent settler colonial apparatus. So initially, of course, the struggle was to launch a liberation from outside, from the countries surrounding Palestine. And we saw in previous episodes how by 1982, what had started as a revolutionary campaign that included Palestinian bases in most of the areas bordering the settler colonial Israeli state, including Jordan and, of course, southern Lebanon. The Palestinian presence eventually got concentrated in Lebanon. So destroying that presence, making sure that it doesn't exist, meant that Palestinians no longer had the military capacity to wage armed struggle from outside of Palestine. Now, the exit from Beirut meant that the focus of the PLO shifted to the inside, and in particular, to the territories that were occupied in 1967, particularly the West Bank and Gaza. And this became an important shift politically because it consolidated the previous trend that had started in the mid-1970s to try to seek a settlement that would result in an independent Palestinian sovereign state in those territories, which, of course, do not constitute the majority of Palestine. They're only 22% of it. But it was out of the principle that, if you don't take it now, you're going to lose potentially all of it. So there was this view that was beginning to become dominant, especially after 82, it gained the strength that went in that direction. Now, there were also weakening factors that took place inside the Palestinian movement as a result of 82, besides the loss of territorial presence for military projection. You also had, in addition to that, internal splits resulting from the 82 exit. In particular, the Fatah movement, which was the largest Palestinian political movement, had split. And this was, of course, a split that was facilitated and encouraged by Hafiz al-Assad of Syria. He caused an internal split. It had its own internal causes as well, but it wouldn't have happened without his support and encouragement. So the internal causes had to do with the military performance in 82. The idea on the part of some sections of the Fatah left that there should not be an exit from Lebanon to a faraway place like Tunisia, which is what ended up happening under Yasser Arafat. He opted to go to Tunis to establish his presence. Tunis became the headquarters of the PLO. And of course, Tunis does not have borders with Palestine. The most Palestinian leftist figures within Fatah certainly had this preference for a place like Syria because it's next door. But of course, Arafat had a deep revulsion towards the Assad government and its interference in Palestine, first since 1976, of course, and even earlier. So he was not going to go under the control of any Arab state, especially Syria, which had a disproportionate amount of interference in Palestinian affairs from day one. So you ended up having this internal conflict that was, of course, facilitated from outside and encouraged from outside, that really, created problems within the Palestinian movement. You also had simultaneously the rise of internal challenges. New political movements suddenly started emerging out of this impasse that was being faced by the national movement, which tended to operate along secular lines, either leftist or patriotic lines. Sometimes it's referred to in the literature as nationalist lines. I actually reject that analysis. We've talked about it before. I think there was a very strong sense of Palestinian patriotism in Fatah, not necessarily nationalism of the sort that people sometimes characterize it as. But anyways, the patriotic and the leftist forces were now confronted with a new competitor, which is the Islamic forces, of course. And we'll talk about that. I think we'll contextualize it more broadly. But that is another outcome of 82. Had the PLO been still strong in Beirut and coherent and able to function the way it did before with its full civic and military and diplomatic strength, the political map would have looked very, very different. So as the PLO became more and more involved, so accompanying the exit from Beirut to Tunis was a very intense effort on the part of all the Palestinian leaderships to increase their activities in the occupied territories. Now, they had already had special branches for dealing with that, and there were already years of mobilization inside the West Bank and Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and of course East Jerusalem. But those years of mobilization were also accompanied by the political weight being centered outside, initially in Jordan and later in Beirut. Now we saw a focus on essentially creating a popular uprising inside Palestine, and here I actually take issue with much of the literature that discusses that uprising that eventually took place, which is the First Intifada, or what was referred to as the First Intifada. Actually, there were several mini intifadas that preceded it, including in 82. Much of that literature suggests that it was just a spontaneous act that took place, and then the Palestinian leadership just needed to catch up with it. So they came in later and then tried to essentially take it over. That is based on my historical research on the subject and countless interviews with different cadres and also just examining what was going on before the First Intifada. And it doesn't make much sense, this view, because yes, the actual spark happened spontaneously, but the buildup, the organizational infrastructure was already there to be able to carry it through. So the First Intifada was actually carried through by political cadres that belonged to the major political movements and parties that were a part of the PLO. And of course, the additional factor there was that now they were joined also by parties that were outside the PLO, that were religious parties that promoted commitment to Islam. So mainly Hamas and, of course, to a lesser extent, Islamic Jihad. So the First Intifada then was this effervescence of popular energy and organization that took place. It drew on the strength of mobilization that had happened before, including, by the way, in the prisons, which became universities for the people in many ways. People educated themselves politically in the prisons far more than even outside the prisons in the 1970s and 80s, because you could actually talk and congregate there. Outside the prisons, the Israelis had a severe regime of control and surveillance. All Palestinian literature was banned. All Palestinian symbols were banned, including the Palestinian flag, of course. You could be punished for anything, for wearing the wrong set of colors, for carrying the wrong sort of book. And of course, what we saw in the First Intifada was a challenge to all of this. It was an intifada that also was very much cross-generational in its nature. There were people from multiple generations participating, including the youth who became the symbols of that movement. You had these stone-throwing youth that were exhibiting their anger and resistance towards the Israeli occupation by challenging the soldiers with nothing other than their bare hands and whatever stones they could find on the street. So this was an incredible movement. For the most part, it drew on civic energies. It drew on boycotts. It drew on the development of parallel education after the Israelis shut down the educational institutions and the universities. They've been engaging in what we call scholasticide for a long time. They've been trying to destroy education in Palestine for a long time. So during the First Intifada, they would close down the schools, the universities, to prevent the people from congregating, from meeting, from acting together collectively. And people challenged that. You had a refusal to pay taxes to the Israeli authorities. You had a total policy, essentially, of non-cooperation. So this was one of the greatest examples of civic mobilization in the 1980s anywhere. And it became really a driving force for political change in Palestine during that period, from 1987 until 1992.
It was met with brutal Israeli repression.
Yes, and actually, the people carrying out that repression are people that are often described as doves.
Yitzhak Rabin said to break the bones of protesters, something along those lines.
Not just protesters, break the bones of Palestinian children. These were the people they were breaking the bones of. So all of these kids were being subjected to actual intentional bone breaking and physical assaults. Now, what took place, of course, during the same period, you had, of course, an Israeli campaign to try to present what they were doing as countering terrorism and violence and so on. So, they've always done that. Like whenever the people rise up, even when they did that, so in the style of the First Intifada, which was predominantly nonviolent, not that I ever wish to reduce national liberation struggle to this binary of violent and nonviolent, which is totally fictional, and it's totally actually politically directed to delegitimize national liberation struggles. Can you imagine, Daniel, if people started saying, "Oh, we would have rather had the American Revolution as being nonviolent"? These Republicans and even Democrats and others that are like mainstream American politicians, they celebrate the violence of the American Revolution, of course. They see it as a great act. But then when it comes to something like Palestine, even something that was far less violent, like the First Intifada, they try to delegitimize it sometimes.
I mean, just exemplary of that is the absurd, surreal, but very effective demonization of youth throwing stones. It just,
Yes,
at tanks.
yes, and we have brilliant Palestinian scholars that have been studying this phenomena for a long time, like Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who has been, of course, arrested and recently and really subjected to horrible treatment. I mean, she's a total hero, and I love her, and I think all of us should be reading her. She talks about this in feminist terms, and she examines this through the lens of what she calls unchilding. She says the children of Palestine are subjected to unchilding. They're treated as if they are not children. They're not human beings at all. You can break their bones, you can do whatever you want to them, and it's totally legit as far as this discourse is concerned.
Let's turn back to 1979 when the Islamic Revolution brought down the Shah in Iran. We had to sort of skip over this giant event in Thawra's final trilogy on the Palestinian Revolution, but we really can't overstate how important the Islamic Revolution was. Obviously in Iran, but everywhere across the region. It was a huge blow to American power and had this widespread impact on regional politics, including on the Palestinian movement. Under the Shah, Iran had been a pillar of imperialist and reactionary power in the region, including, as we discussed in an earlier episode, by playing a critical role in defeating the Dhofari Revolution in Oman. And then it also very much provided this new religious idiom for anti-imperialist and even social justice politics in the region, something we're going to be getting into a lot more later. What was the significance of the victorious Islamic Revolution for politics in the Arab East, including for the Palestinian Revolution?
So this is a very complicated question because, of course, as you mentioned, the Iranian Revolution had far-reaching impact on multiple zones. When it came to Palestine, it was viewed, including by the highest echelons of the Palestinian leadership, especially Yasser Arafat, as a great event that would compensate for the exit of Egypt from the Palestinian liberation arena and its entry into the arena of treaties with the Israeli state and complete submission to the American project in the region. So with Egypt out after Camp David, the Islamic Revolution happened simultaneously with that. And Iran could counterbalance the weight of Egypt geopolitically. It's not an Arab state, but it is a Muslim state, and it is in the neighborhood, and it's a very large state. So it's what they call in international relations literature a middle power, classic one, which means that it could project a heavy weight in its immediate regions. It might not be able to, operate globally like a great power does, but it can definitely operate in its regional neighborhood very strongly. So Yasser Arafat saw the opportunity in that. Now, the interesting thing is that, of course, the Palestinian Revolution had a very bad relationship with the Shah for many years because the Shah was allied to the Israeli state. Now, this alliance was very quietly conducted, but nevertheless, it was a major bone of contention between him and popular forces in Iran, including Ayatollah Khomeini. By the way, the speech that Ayatollah Khomeini made in Iran that resulted in his initial expulsion from Iran, had principally included a section on Palestine that resulted in his expulsion, because he compared the Shah to Yazid bin Muawiyah, this figure that is seen as a villainous one in the Shia tradition. Essentially, he was saying that this Shah, who has dealings with the Israeli usurper state, is essentially a new Yazid. And that, of course, was not going to be tolerated by the Iranian state. Now, Khomeini and the Islamic wing of the Iranian opposition had their own interest in the Palestinian scene. They were not particularly close to it. Some of their cadres had entered the Palestinian Revolution and trained there, but actually, it's the other opposition groups, especially those of the left, that had a very close relationship. So, up till the mid 70s, the PLO's classic relationship was with the Iranian left parties. And those parties had a very serious commitment towards Palestine. And again, they were armed and supporting in the PLO bases. And yeah, so the Iranian left was very focused on the Palestinian Revolution for many reasons, especially in the 1970s. It started to associate it with much stronger anti-colonial internationalist fervor. And it saw it as a source of inspiration and support. And this was, by the way, akin to the situation of the Turkish left, which later provided the seeds for the growth of the PKK and the Kurdish movement in Turkey. Not many people know this, but the PKK was actually formed in a Palestinian military base. It made its decisions to launch its own armed struggle in Turkey in that context. So you have all of the groups. This was a moment where Palestine was basically the center of anti-colonial politics regionally in the Middle East. So it attracted Iranians, it attracted Turks, and of course, it attracted tens of thousands of Arabs from across the region, in addition to those training from other parts of the world. But I mean, anybody belonging to this region had a very strong connection with Palestine at this stage if they believed in leftist politics. And the advantage in the Palestinian political arena was that it was very pluralist, which meant that you could find somebody to train with that's closer to your politics. So even Iranian Islamists could find some people that are closer to their scene. The Iranian left could find people of different shades and colors to train with. If you were a Maoist, you could find Maoists. If you had other directions and interests, you could find them. So it was one of those special moments in modern Middle Eastern history where you had an active national liberation struggle facilitating multiple struggles in the surrounding region.
And these are the left-wing Iranian forces that, alongside the religious forces, orchestrated the revolution, but then were severely marginalized afterwards.
Yes, I mean,
and repressed.
The leftists and the Islamists alike participated, of course, in the Islamic Revolution, which was one of the great social revolutions of our time. In fact, you could argue that it is the greatest social revolution to be witnessed in the late 20th century. This was not a random coup. This was not this was, everybody was out there in the streets for days and on end, and there was an effervescence of activity from across the political spectrum and from all sections of society. So, of course, you had this initial participation of different groups, but then you ended up with one current being dominant and marginalizing the others, as you mentioned, and that was, of course, the religious current, which had far-reaching implications. Now, that religious current was promoting an ideology that was initially seen by the Palestinians in favorable terms, the ideology of a revolutionary resistance to the United States, the ideology of expelling imperialism, because that meant immediately that Iran was going to exit from the Israeli orbit and from the American orbit. And Khomeini made a point of doing this symbolically and with great fanfare. So he handed over the site of the Israeli official building in Tehran. It wasn't an embassy, but it was equivalent to an embassy, basically. And essentially, he gave it to the PLO, and Yasser Arafat came and received it, and it was like a big deal. Another interesting thing that he was doing was that he was parading Yasser Arafat all the time around. Yasser Arafat received the hero's welcome in Tehran when he came there. There were like hundreds of thousands of people in the streets coming to welcome him. All of it was incredible. I mean, our listeners can Google videos actually of that moment of Yasser Arafat in Tehran after the revolution, and you can see even the handing over of that building for those that are interested. So this was a big moment. It had a lot of symbolism to it, and Khomeini also was very keen to demonstrate this connection with the Palestinian Revolution by having Arafat as the only serious international dignitary to visit him. You know, Khomeini did not receive that many international leaders. In fact, almost none in that period. Only Yasser Arafat, only the Palestinian leader did that. So there was this kind of elevation of the Palestinian cause that was very intentional. Now, Khomeini was a very purposive person, so shouldn't be just understood as in purely romantic terms. He was trying, of course, this is a cause that could result in internal mobilization. This is a cause that has multiple dimensions to it, but he has his own reasons to also commit to it, including his own religious ideology, but also his need for symbols that could mobilize his base, essentially. In any case, we end up with a situation where Arafat is very excited about having a coalition with Iran. But what distorts the picture is that there's another side to the Iranian ideology promoted by Khomeini, which is the ideology of exporting the revolution. And if you're going to export the revolution, that means you're going to export it to places like next door Iraq. And next door Iraq is a place with a very substantial Shia population. You know, it is, in fact, almost a numerical majority. You know, the Sunnis, if you count the Arab Sunnis and the Kurds, they come as just slightly less than the Shia in Iraq. But you know, definitely the Shia are the biggest group in the country religiously. And if you're coming and you're encouraging this ideology that says that there should be the jurisprudence of the rule of the jurists, you know, which means the rule of Khomeini, the rule of clerics like him on earth. It's an innovation in Shia theology. You know, that has far-reaching ramifications, because then you're telling essentially the Iraqi Shia that they should not be following Saddam and the Ba'athist rulers. They should be following the jurist. The wilayat al-faqih becomes a big aspect. So that's a direct threat to Iraq. And it destabilizes the arrangement that had existed between Iraq and Iran under the Shah. Certainly from the mid-70s onwards, Iraq essentially gave serious territorial concessions in exchange to Iran, in exchange for Iran not supporting the Kurdish rebellion in the north of Iraq. So there was, and we've talked about different Kurdish revolutionary outbreaks and so on in different periods in previous episodes. But now what you were seeing was the original source of support for these movements was being cut, because the Shah was essentially using them as cards, geopolitical cards. He didn't care for Kurdish nationalism or Kurdish independence. In fact, he was opposed to it. But he did care for creating pressure on the Iraqi state. The minute he gets the territorial concessions from the Iraqi state he wanted, he removed this support. So, but that was a painful moment, because, of course, Saddam had to sign off on these concessions. Now, with the outbreak of the Iranian Revolution, you have a situation where Saddam is seeing a shifting map. On the one hand, there's a serious threat to the Iraqi government and the Iraqi state coming from the export of the wilayat al-faqih and the revolutionary ideology. On the other hand, there's an opportunity to reverse the concessions that he had made, especially around the border areas in the Iranian province of Khuzestan, which is known in Arabic as Arabistan, and which actually is Ahwaz, the Ahwaz region. So this situation creates the seeds for a major conflict to explode, Daniel. And it's encouraged by the fact that the Americans now have beef with the Iranians. They had enabled the Shah in the past to be, a very strong force in the region because, of course, he was playing the function of their policeman in the Middle East. Now, the Saddam was thinking, well, maybe I'll play that role for the Americans. They need me to stop the spread of the Iranian Revolution.
Let's get into the broader turn away from secular, nationalist, often socialist or even communist politics across the Arab East toward a resistance politics anchored in Islamic religious parties and movements. In 1979, hundreds of religious guerrillas laid siege to the Grand Mosque in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. That same year, of course, the Islamic Revolution took place in Iran. And so did the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan next door to Iran, an invasion that was resisted by U.S. and Pakistan-backed mujahideen forces whose leadership included a young, wealthy Saudi man named Osama bin Laden. In 1981 in Egypt, President Anwar Sadat, who had, after Nasser's death, remade the once revolutionary country into this vanguard of Israel normalizing reaction, Sadat was assassinated by members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and his death notably mourned by Israeli and U.S. leaders, not by the Egyptian people or other Arab leaders. Turning to Syria, in early 1982, Hafez al-Assad carried out an absolutely enormous massacre in the Syrian city of Hama after Sunni Muslim Brotherhood forces rebelled against him. Everything that I just recounted, that's just a 3-year span of history. How did this form of religious politics end up so powerfully supplanting more left-wing, secular nationalist resistance forces across the region? And more specifically, what role did the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and other reactionary forces play in facilitating that shift?
As we know, Nasser was the biggest anchor for the sort of anti-imperialist, but also secular politics that predominated in the 1950s and 60s. So that depended on the presence of characters like Nasser, and of course, others in the region, like Abdul Karim Qasim in Iraq and his successors, depended on the presence of political parties like the Movement of Arab Nationalists and the Ba'ath and the communists that were very active at the time. Now, that brand of politics had always had its competing forces ready for it. So you had political movements that were religiously conservative and that had a serious disagreement, to put it actually mildly, with the leftist tradition, the Arab leftist tradition. Okay, and mainly, of course, the strongest and biggest of these movements is the Muslim Brotherhood. So you have organized political forces that are popular political forces that are promoting a more conservative social agenda. Sometimes these forces are promoting also an anti-imperialist agenda, but during this period, they were less likely to clash with imperialism directly for many reasons. And during this period, they were more focused on basically carrying out broad mobilizations inside their societies that were geared at promoting greater religiosity and that were geared towards reversing some of the developments that were taking place, under these secular states. So social questions and culture wars played a big role in the 50s and 60s. They did not like, and this often included wars over the control over the female body. There was major struggles over how women dressed, and that became like a big theme. But also, there was another theme that had to do with the nature of the state. They often demanded that there should be an Islamic constitution, that there should be an application of religious law, and of course, this was not how the state under Nasser or any other of these leaders operated. Now, somebody like Nasser, by the way, was not an atheist. He was a pious man. In fact, he prayed But he did not believe that the state should carry out a religious agenda. So the Muslim Brotherhood had a different perspective on this. You have this situation, though, where the clash between Nasser and Faisal, especially after Yemen and the Yemeni Revolution of 1962, you have the Saudi state coming in and essentially saying, look, we have to counter this political project and we have to counter it with an alternative ideology. This project is focusing on anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. So we need to actually, we can't come and say we're against that. But what we can do is say that these people are steering the region away from Islam and that they're actually promoting essentially atheism and communism. So that becomes like a big theme in the propaganda of that period. Simultaneously, you have a situation where after every crackdown against the Muslim Brotherhood that was carried out by Nasser, you had their exiles being hosted in Saudi Arabia and, of course, later on in other Gulf countries. And as we know, increasingly the economic power in this region was shifting from the old major established urban centers and big agricultural countries that had dominated the region historically because of their agricultural, ability and because of their cities and so on, like Egypt, like Iraq, and of course places like Syria. But now we have the economic power shifting to the oil-producing regions that happen to be ruled by conservative monarchies. And of course, we've explained in previous episodes why these monarchies were ruling in these places. It wasn't that the people there were at fault or that they were not, good enough or anything like that for democracy. It was because every popular struggle there was suppressed, including, the different revolutionary movements that we discussed in the Arabian Peninsula. So the British and the Americans had a very serious interest in maintaining the monarchical status quo in that region for obvious reasons. As part of that, you had this promotion of political Islam in this period. So to counter the Arab League, for example, King Faisal goes and starts the organization of the Muslim Conference. So he starts promoting these universities, puritanical version of Islam. And there's an extra focus on social conservatism. It's similar, very similar to what's going on in the United States today. All of these abstinence movements and all of this kind of conservative campaigns against abortion and against trans people and so on. They had their equivalents in these campaigns that were focused on religious virtue, modesty, certain practice, following the teachings of the Prophet in a literal way, showing symbols, performative type of, religious politics where you grow your beard and you wear certain types of clothes. And of course, we know that these things change with time. They were claiming that this is the way it should be and it should have been and it always has been. And of course, there were pious Muslims that did not grow their beards in that way or did not dress in a certain way. And, they were saying that that was a total deviation from the original religion. So you have this puritanical push happening, but it's very politicized and it's very much connected to the state struggle that was going on. And it's a struggle between monarchies and republics in its initial iteration. And it's a struggle between monarchies tied to the West and republics that were trying to create a non-aligned path in this world politically at the time. Now, by the time Sadat comes back, Sadat comes to power and Nasser dies. Sadat sees an opportunity in promoting religious politics as well, because he needs to fill the void that was going to happen after he abandons the Nasser's project. And of course, he was abandoning the Nasser's project in two ways. One, when it comes to regional politics, he was reorienting Egypt from a non-aligned stance to the American orbit. And that meant also, removing Egypt's dependency on Soviet weapons. And that, of course, meant also signing deals with the Israeli state. So And then on the other hand, in addition to this angle, he was also opening up the economy in what was called the Intifada, the opening up period, which meant abandoning socialist policies. So how do you create a politics of legitimation that allows for this void to be filled that was created by Sadat abandoning the Nasser's project, but also essentially cracking down on the previous supporters of the Free Officers government that had endorsed it because of that project. And he turns to the Muslim Brotherhood. And he brings back some of the exiles that had been in the Gulf, but also opens up the door for greater religiosity and religious activism and expression politically. And this becomes also a way of ensuring that there's a strong current that's doing character assassination of Nasser. Because, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood has serious and of course legitimate grievances with Nasser. He had imprisoned their leaders, he had executed some of them. They were essentially telling all of these horror stories about Nasser, which was very convenient for Sadat. Now, what Sadat did not realize is that this was gonna, actually result in the loss of his own life eventually. These forces that he thought he could control were not going to be too happy when he takes it too far in his journey with imperialism. Because these Islamic forces, they're very socially conservative, yes, but not all of them are pro-imperialist. In fact, none of them are pro-imperialist. Some of them might, for pragmatic reasons, play around with the US or with other powers like that. But they, for the most part, they will tell you that they believe in independence and they believe in Palestine, and they don't believe in making agreements with the Americans and certainly supporting the Israelis. So, Sadat thought that he could get away with signing Camp David, shifting Egypt completely, and at the same time promoting religious politics without, incurring a cost on himself. But of course, that was not the case, and he ends up being assassinated by, of course, a member of this trend that we're just describing.
What should we make of this dynamic that emerged with an increasingly sidelined secular nationalist left leaving the political stage or fading from the political stage as these religious movements, sometimes armed, increasingly come into conflict with authoritarian states across the region, both U.S. allies like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and also enemies of the West like Syria, because it seems like what we're seeing here is a move from this regional conflict pitting republics against monarchies to a set of conflicts pitting Islamic religious movements against these very different sorts of authoritarian security states.
Well, what happens with Islamic religious movements initially is that they develop two types of wings, okay? One has a very good relationship with monarchical conservative states. The mainstream Muslim Brotherhood continues throughout the 80s, for example, to have a very good relationship with the Gulf states, with Jordan, even in the 90s. In some cases, this continues until the Arab Spring. So you have a certain set of mainstream religious movements like the Muslim Brotherhood that are, operating in that way. But then you have the offshoots as well. And the offshoots are being driven by different sort of politics. And sometimes they were encouraged by the conservative states for geopolitical purposes. But then these geopolitical purposes, after they're completed or they're exhausted, these movements still exist, and you get stuck with them. And this is exactly what happened for the Saudis, for example, with their support for Salafi jihadist ideology. That was something that they and the Americans needed for Afghanistan. They wanted to create a situation where the Soviets would leave Afghanistan. And it was a total Cold War situation, They wanted to exhaust the Soviet Union. They wanted to prolong conflict there. So they arm essentially very movements that become the basis for Al-Qaeda, become the basis for all what's known as what's sometimes referred to as Islamist movements, and I don't really like, but as Islamist jihadist movements. And what you have then is this explosion of interest in sponsoring groups like this, arming them, training them militarily, and they open the doors for volunteering for these groups, for raising money for these groups. And I even remember it from my childhood. In places like Jordan, there were so many people that were volunteering very openly. It was like totally okay. It was that anti-communist push, and it aligned with American policies. So it was encouraged.
Against godless communism.
Against godless communism. So that creates a certain environment as well, because these groups are saying that they're representatives of the true Islam, and that all other forms of Islam are not real. They're groups that engage not only in opposition to foreign bases in places like Afghanistan, and later on, of course, they reject imperial bases, the American imperial bases in Saudi Arabia, which becomes their main problem with the Saudi regime. But in this period, they're focusing on the Soviets, but they're also saying that other Muslims that are not following their ideology are not real Muslims. So that becomes a big problem, and leads to a further shift to the right in the region as a whole. Now, this corresponds to a global shift to the right. You have the decline of the Soviet Union, the decline of socialist states in general. This view that socialism has failed is spreading increasingly in the 1980s because people are associating the Soviet model with socialism. You also have regionally a bunch of setbacks. I mean, 67, of course, is the biggest one that really is a blow to the prestige of states that proclaim socialism, like Egypt. But then everything that follows also is connected to this. The political repression that was associated with these states, the lack of democratic freedoms, all of this became associated with socialism. And suddenly socialism was no longer this idea of creating a society where the means of production are owned by the people, and where there's greater space for human freedom, actually, through economic empowerment for everyone. It becomes the opposite. It's the limit to human freedom. And of course, that's not the only story that we see in places like Syria and Iraq. There were positive developments. There was better education. There was a more accessible education for the poorer classes and the peasantry. There was all sorts of developments that did take place, even under Hafiz and Saddam and characters like that. But the other side of the equation was not that great, and it affected how people viewed these states on a popular level. Now, in Syria, actually, the religious activation of religious violence, or violence on the part of movements that claim to be religious in character, comes earlier. So even before Afghanistan. So they started in 74 in Syria. And that has to do with the specific dynamics operating there after the Ba'ath became predominantly associated with Hafiz al-Assad.
And increasingly with Alawites, and like the sort of increasingly sectarian character of the regime.
Yes, and of course, it's totally exaggerated on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time that this was just a purely Alawite regime. However, of course, it did have and did draw disproportionately on recruitment in the security services from Alawi areas. And we've talked about this before. I don't think actually that somebody like Hafiz al-Assad was really a genuine sectarian, but he was definitely a political careerist, and he was obsessed with power. And he knew that it's better to have your relatives and people from surrounding regions surrounding yours, staffing the security services for your own political survival. And in that case, he was relying on his previous experiences, of course, within the Syrian army during a period where so many coups had happened. So his struggle was to create a base of support that is steady and that is permanently geared towards him. The downside to that is that then you're opening the space for people to come and say, well, look, here's a country with a vast Sunni majority population, and it's being ruled by this tiny minority. It was difficult to argue against that at that stage when the more religious elements in the Muslim Brotherhood were making that case. Not all the Muslim Brotherhood was entirely engaging in this, but there was enough of a section to come and say, oh, look, this is a sectarian regime, it has to be rebelled against. Now, how to engage in opposition was the big question that was confronting the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria at the time. And for the most part, actually, they did not want a direct fight with the regime. The Muslim Brotherhood is conservative, not only in its social outlook, but also actually in its political strategies. It tends to be cautious, does not like direct confrontations with existing powers. Certainly not at that stage in the early 70s, not in Egypt, not in Palestine, not anywhere. Okay, in Syria, they were opposed to a direct confrontation with Hafez al-Assad and his forces. However, a section of the Muslim Brotherhood developed that called itself a vanguard force, a fighting vanguard. That's how they described themselves. Okay? And طليعة مقاتلة. And they were saying, we're going to actually confront this regime with a campaign of political assassinations. That's how they start initially. And then they take it to the next level by essentially focusing on a lot of the Alawi officers, Alawi politicians, but also some other politicians from other backgrounds that were engaging, including Sunni ones that were seen as collaborating with the regime. So you have this period, very tense period in the mid-1970s, from 1974 onwards in Syria, right after the 73 war, where you have assassinations happening regularly, where you have local fights happening. You have also some major, big events, like there was a massacre in Aleppo of Alawi cadets that, was carried out again by this vanguard group. And the Syrian regime decides that, and this is very typical of that regime, instead of, let's say, singling out this vanguard and saying, okay, I'm fighting that, they decide, oh, this is the Muslim Brotherhood as a whole. So they actually drag the Muslim Brotherhood into this bigger fight by cracking down on all of them. Whether, of course, they were their historic enemies. I mean, the Ba'ath and the Brotherhood never were on good terms. But at the same time, this created tensions that really exist to this very day and that played a huge role in all of the horrors that happened in Syria over the past 14 years or so. So when you look at the history of how the regime dealt with this 1970s outbreak of assassinations and violent operations, it was very heavy-handed. It did not discriminate between different types of Islamic political movements, and it certainly did not distinguish between the Muslim Brotherhood and this more armed offshoot that came out of it. That, of course, culminates eventually in the Hama massacres of 1982, which end this period of unrest that had started from the 74 onwards, but also end the Islamic challenge to the regime. So the situation there, in many ways, though, resurfaces. Some of the dynamics resurface later.
And it really is just one of the bloodiest acts of repression carried out by an Arab leader in modern Arab history.
I mean, it was a major act of repression, and not just repression. It was a massacre. I mean, there was a lot of civilians were killed, innocent civilians. Much of Hama, the city of Hama, was destroyed. The regime had of course, the biggest role in this. But I'll say this, and it might not be a popular view, but also the previous campaign that was carried out that did take a sectarian character, that did include, assassinations, explosions, massacres in some cases, was not that great either. So, there is a context to it. It's not just, pure Hafiz Assad evil, even though I think he's very capable of doing evil, and he doesn't. Political survival, he'll do anything for it, and same goes for his son. But in the dig in here in Thawra, definitely we look at the deeper causes and dynamics, and definitely here you had a context to it. It doesn't justify it. It was a horror. Amal was disgusting what took place there.
In terms of this ruthless drive for political survival, that pattern that you noted really extended eastward toward Iraq. Assad's Alawi Latakia region had its counterpart, in a sense, right, in Saddam Hussein's Sunni Tikrit. In both cases, sectarianism was not so much the goal, it was the product of these authoritarian Ba'athist leaders leveraging existing networks to maintain their rule.
Right. And one thing I should note is one of the interesting facts of both what was taking place in Iraq and in Syria is that the competition between these two different wings of the Ba'ath, the Syrian and the Iraqi, resulted in the intensification of this bloodshed that was happening internally along even sectarian lines. So the Muslim Brotherhood insurgency in Syria was, for example, supported by Saddam Hussein because he was keen to undermine, even though he doesn't agree with them, he doesn't, obviously ideologically, he has nothing in common with the Muslim Brotherhood at this stage, but he definitely would have liked to see the fall of Hafiz al-Assad, or at least pressure being put on him. So in the same way, and this is a theme that we see throughout this period and in the region as a whole, the manipulation of different social fissures and national, ethnic, and sectarian fissures for geopolitical purposes is a theme we see consistently applied, certainly by external imperial powers playing in this region, but also by local actors. And we see this in relation to the Kurdish movement. We see this in relation to these different social movements that were operating in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. Sometimes these regional capitals that were promoting serious internal strife did not agree with these movements that they were supporting, but they supported them nevertheless. So that's one thing to note. Another thing to note is that I sometimes think that when we say Ba'athist, by the way, we're almost doing disservice to the Ba'ath, because by now, by this period,
these are militarists who've taken over the Ba'athist movement.
They have nothing to do with the original ideology, which, I mean, if you read like people like Munif al-Azzaz and so on, they were very, these were people that actually focused on the question of freedom, for example. They were generally, belonging to a school of thought that was influenced even by Fabianism, they were talking about even individual freedoms heavily in their literature. So ideologically, it's a very, very, very different project than the one that was pursued by Saddam and Hafiz. And this is of course a well-known fact within that party that all of its original leaderships and ideologues had been completely sidelined by the time we get to this period.
I want to turn back to 1980 and the Iraqi invasion of Iran, which of course marked the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. And you already laid out some of the key context here in terms of how the Islamic Revolution dramatically upset the status quo in so many ways. The war ultimately took hundreds of thousands of lives, and notably and quite tragically, it was a war between two self-described anti-imperialist regimes rather than the sort of united anti-imperialist war against Israel and the Western powers that radicals throughout the region had long dreamed of. Why did this war erupt when and in the way that it did, and then go on to last for 8 long, brutal years? What were the consequences across the region? And then you got into this a little before, but what should we make of the regional and global forces aligning as they did, with the Soviets backing Iraq alongside the United States and the Gulf states, even as the United States quietly played the other side of the conflict as well? To recap, why did the war start and play out the way that it did? And then how did it take this larger regional and global geopolitical shape that it did, with the West allying with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, a supposed enemy of Western imperialism?
Well, let's start with the so-called border dispute over which this war started. You have this region which is called Khuzestan in Iranian terminology, and which the Iraqis refer to as Arabistan. But as we mentioned, it's the region around Ahwaz. Yeah, this region historically had, and certainly in the case of Iran, is very important because it has this historic importance for oil production. It is where much of Iranian oil gets produced. But this region also has an Arab ethnic majority in the area around the oil production. Even though, of course, the Iranian state has been settling in a lot of Persian populations there over the years, precisely for security reasons, because they don't want to prevent the rise of a national question there in this key area for the Iranian economy. So the region had been ruled, of course, by an Arabic ruler, but that had a certain relationship of vassalage to the Shah's court. And that meant that you had a situation where by the mid-1920s, the Iranian state comes in and says, we're going to take out this ruler, and we're going to impose the rule of the central state. Now, as you have the rise of nationalism and nation states and whatever, it becomes much more important what's the ethnicity here. And there's this, Arab claim on this territory. And it's, of course, a territory that's very close to Basra in Iraq. That's the closest big city in its vicinity. The population there speaks Arabic. They're from an Arab tribal background. So there's a very strong connection with Iraq, and Iraq considers it to be part of its territory. Iran, of course, says, no, it's not. This is always had a vassal state situation with Iran. It was always part of the Persian Empire in recent, at least, memory. So therefore, it is part of Iran, and it should be under the rule of the central Iranian state. So that's the initial issue relating to the territory under question. From the Iraqi perspective, there's an additional difficulty, which is that these areas are around a sensitive part of Iraq, which is Shatt al-Arab, which is where this is essentially Iraq's major waterway into the Gulf, and which allows it then to ship to other parts of the world, and is in that area. And of course, the Iranians, not only were they claiming the bigger area, which is Ahwaz and Khuzestan, but they were also there was also a dispute on where the boundaries lay between that area and Iraq. And of course, they had gained advantages in that conceptualization of where the boundaries was as a result of the Kurdish, their support for the Kurdish insurgency in the north of Iraq earlier. So, to settle that, the Shah and Saddam agreed that Saddam will make territorial concessions there and in exchange for an end to the war, as we mentioned. So, and of course, that leaves out Mullah Mustafa Barzani of the regional equation for a long time, until the Khomeini decides to reactivate him later on. So in this period, there is a status quo between Iraq and Iran that exists, between the mid-70s and the outbreak of the revolution. But by the time the revolution happens, and this threat is being posed against the Iraqi state, and it's affecting it directly. And we have the Iranian government sponsoring a new type of politics, which is Shia opposition politics in Iraq. And they're actually promoting sectarian parties. Of course, Shia populations had always been politically active in Iraq, but they rarely developed a sectarian party structure. Now, with Iranian sponsorship, you had these parties that were housed in Tehran, that were promoting a sectarian ideology, that were essentially saying that Iraq should be dominated by the Shia and it should have a closer orientation to Iran. This is happening around this time. Saddam is beginning to detect signs that Khomeini is going very aggressive on the exporting of the revolution front. And Khomeini was not hiding it. He was making these fiery speeches. The Iranian radio stations directed at Iraq were calling for the overthrow of the regime and so on. So it was a very difficult period for somebody like Saddam, who of course wants regime survival, but also sees this in national terms. Remember, he is a political despot and so on, but he also has his own beliefs, and they include a belief in Arab nationalism, and he considers that this is a cover for a Persian takeover of an Arab country. So he kept on emphasizing the Arab character of Iraq over the sectarian character, of Shiism in Iraq. But of course, Khomeini was a threat to that project.
And so, how does Saddam Hussein then reconcile his Arab nationalism with such close cooperation with Western imperialist powers and their Gulf state allies?
Well, he sees this as my enemy's enemy is my friend, and so this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to maybe a rare historic opportunity from his perspective. The Americans are signaling that they're not opposed to an attack on Iran. Then maybe he'll be able to make some of the territorial advances in the territories that he had ceded. He could, maybe it could be successful in that, and perhaps that could even result in the downfall of the Khomeini regime, as far as he's concerned. If it loses that war, and maybe then the threat to Iraq will be reduced, the threat of the export of the Iranian Revolution, and its chances of regime survival would go higher. That's how he thought of it. And obviously, his whole calculation was based on this idea that, look, it's not just him that's scared about exporting the revolution. It's the Gulf states. I mean, you've referred earlier to the occupation of the holy sites in Mecca. The Saudis were freaking out. They were saying, look, there's something really dangerous taking place here. It's out of control. Now, of course, those that occupied these sites were not referring to Khomeini's ideology. They were referring to the old days of the Ikhwan movement, which was the original supporters of the Wahhabi call, quite the opposite of the Shia ideology. But it was in an atmosphere of the rising tide of politicized forms of religion. And basically, essentially, Juhayman al-Otaibi and others were just one example of what could take place if things go out of control. Now, on the other hand, you have an even bigger problem directly related to Iran in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, where the oil production is. In a way, it's the opposite problem to the Iranian problem with Ahwaz. In Iran and Ahwaz, they have a national problem, which is that it's an Arab population. In the oil-producing region, eastern Saudi Arabia, they have a sectarian problem, which is that predominantly the original inhabitants of that area are Shia, of Shia descent and background. So, they were doing similar methods of population control and domination on both sides of the Gulf. But in any case, the Saudis were like, okay, what if this project to export the revolution comes to the eastern province, where all the oil production is? The other Gulf states were worried as well of the repercussions of the rise of this radical revolutionary project, which was also anti-monarchical. Remember, the Khomeini decides to establish an Islamic republic, not just an Islamic state. He called it a republic. And he was promoting this form of republicanism, but marrying it and wedding it to ideas of Islam. So he was an enemy of monarchs. There's multiple dimensions to this. So they were afraid. They were afraid. And that meant that they were willing to support a regional war. And they were willing to see Iraq as playing the role of defender of the Arabs. They raised the banner that this was an Arab fight against an expanding Persian imperial push, which was how they were trying to discredit this idea that a revolution expanding. They saw this as actually Iran dominating the Arab region. And Saddam was very much promoting that idea. He even sponsored film that depicted essentially the Iranian regime as representatives of the old pre-Islamic Iranian monarchy that was, essentially liberated. Those people were liberated by the Arab commanders of the Muslim armies during the conquest of Iran. So there was this very famous movie called Al-Qadisiyya that promotes this idea, and it appears conveniently during the time of this war. Saddam was pushing this idea that also he called himself the sword of the Arabs, and the Gulf regimes were promoting that idea. So it was basically the ideological cover for this war. And of course, on the other side of the equation, Khomeini was saying, look, I am here, the Islamic Revolution. I represent Islam against these godless, secular regimes. They're going to, fall under this push that I'm doing. The war did not need to last as long as it did. Initially, there were there was some Iraqi territorial gains initially, and then they were reversed by the Khomeini essentially mobilizing big time in Iran and using Iran's numerical advantage because it's a much larger population than Iraq. Of course, it can draw on a much bigger, conscription army of conscripts. But this is where the Americans come in, because you have these human waves coming in, campaigns that Khomeini had created. And incidentally, by the way, they allow him to consolidate actually his regime this period. The war really was a gift to him in many ways, because when you have a war like that, you can present any opposition as being unpatriotic, and you crack down on it. That's exactly what happened. But in this period, he had all these human waves. They were attacking Iraqi sites, and they came close to taking over Basra, Daniel. Now, this is where the Americans come in. And here we're talking about all sorts of characters that later resurface in the W period, but that were very much in operation in the Reagan period. And these people come in, and they're saying, look, the only way that these human waves can be repelled is through the use of weapons of mass destruction. So they need to be gassed, essentially. And Iraq needs, therefore, this capacity at chemical and biological warfare. So we're going to facilitate that. And that works really well. Suddenly you have thousands and thousands of invading Iranian troops that are coming very close to Basra, which is Iraq's, second largest city. It's like its most important port. It's in the top three. Sorry, it would have been a disastrous blow to Iraq if it fell. But you have the use of these weapons repels these waves, and it leads to the killing of horrific ways of tens of thousands of Iranian soldiers. And that happens with direct facilitation from the US, of course. And it leads then, by the mid-'80s, to a situation of stalemate in a way. There's no territorial gains being made, but you have these horrible attacks on Iraqi and Iranian cities, Air Force attacks, killing thousands of people, all sorts of horrible massacres committed, prisoners of war being taken on both sides. It was really difficult and bleak moment.
And even as the U.S. is facilitating Iraq using chemical weapons against Iranian troops, they're also secretly playing the other side and facilitating weapon sales to Iran.
Exactly. So here's what the U.S. was thinking. It's like, we don't like Iraq either. And also, the Israelis were pushing for this. And of course, they've always had a disproportionate say when it comes to U.S. policy in the Middle East. So for them, this is an opportunity to take out both Iraq and Iran by getting them to fight each other. So they were very involved, by the way, the Israelis, in that scheme as well, as we know. So what came to be known as the Iran-Contra affair was a very complex scheme, essentially, of prolonging the war through supplying, essentially, Iran with weapons that it needed to carry out this effort. And in the meantime, of course, they were supplying Iraq with weapons that allowed it to, and with diplomatic and political backing that allowed it to continue to carry out the war. So,
and for good measure, facilitating a Central American dirty war in Nicaragua.
Yes, and this is where we see the global politics of empire working and being at work. You know, it was a really messed up plan, but it was, you could say it was like a genius plan and at one level, had it not been, of course, exposed later on. But like, it really allowed them to hit three birds with one stone.
The Israeli siege of Beirut that forced the PLO's evacuation, which again is where we finished the final episode of Thawra. That siege was a major event, of course, in a larger Lebanese civil war that in many ways revolved around the Palestinian Revolution, but that also extended well beyond it. How did this multifaceted conflict play out over the next 8 years? What finally brought it to a formal end in 1990, and what happened to the PLO's major left-wing allies, forces like the Lebanese National Movement?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about this, Daniel, is that people often speak of the Lebanese civil war as a guerre pour les autres, a war for others. That's certainly a popular version in Lebanon. But of course, if you look at the historic facts, and here, of course, they're mainly referring to Palestinians and maybe sometimes to the Syrians. But the Palestinian involvement in the war did not last more than a year and a half. You know, the PLO actually did not fight actively in this war for more than a year and a half. So this is a very important thing for our listeners to know. The war was a product of essentially Lebanese dynamics, unresolved Lebanese internal dynamics. It was the fourth civil war to take place in Lebanon since 1842. So this is important to note. Now, of course, it was the biggest, but it was the fourth. So we have a situation where once the Palestinian role ends, and really it ends with 1976 and the entry of Syrian troops and the outcome of that. And the PLO still is a major player, but it's no longer really fighting directly against the other side, which is the militias of what was referred to in Palestinian circles as the Quwait and Izaliya, the isolationist powers, which were representing, of course, the Kataib, the Falange party and its allies. The parties, however, that were involved in the war had leftist character during the time of the PLO years, for the most part. But this changes. You know, you had the majority of the Shia population in the south aligning for the most part with the Communist Party, with the Ba'ath, with sometimes movement for Arab nationalists, definitely in many cases joining even Palestinian political groups and movements and military movements. And in the case of the Druze, which were another major group that was involved in this, and here, by the way, I'm using the sectarian terms not because I want to promote them, but because they're actually identified as such in the Lebanese political system, unfortunately. They're led initially up till the Syrian assassination of Kemal Jumblat by a political leader that claims to be pursuing a secular agenda and that calls his party the Progressive Socialist Party. So the left character is very strong during the PLO years. And during the PLO years, another feature that's there, even after the PLO withdraws from direct fighting, it is still the major political broker internally, because it is the strongest force within this kind of coalition that is backing the what was referred to as the Lebanese national movement, which is this coalition of different leftist parties and other groups that we just mentioned. So so long as the PLO is there, you don't have the outbreak of extreme sectarian massacres and so on coming from that front. But things do change after the PLO leaves. And in particular, things go bad in Maronite Druze fighting in the mountain after the PLO leaves. You know, Yasser Arafat, even though many Maronite groups do not have a favorable view of him inside Lebanon, but he did not and would not have allowed for the sort of massacres that took place during the mountain war between the Druze and the Maronites later after the exit of the PLO. And you know, of course, you know, those massacres were committed on both sides. It was an ugly sectarian war. It wasn't like, you know, there was any good side to it. The Phalange were never good. They caused the whole thing. They led the whole country into the war. But and you know, they were allied with Israel, and they were pushing an agenda that was trying to create a separatist sectarian order in a country that is very mixed. Once they were challenged on the idea of equality, you know, they wouldn't allow for sectarian equality of representation politically. So the other option that they had was either we dominate in the mixed order or we separate. And both were not politically tenable projects in a place like Lebanon. This is why I say that the Phalange were politically at fault. Later on, even you get worse things than the Phalange, like the Awat, the Lebanese forces. You know me, Daniel, like I like to look at things from a distance and in a very measured way. When you look at the political projects and agendas, they're actually bankrupt. That's the problem with them. But, you know, they're presented as political agendas and projects that would have allowed for the existence of a separate Christian culture and so on and so forth. So they're opposed to any form of coexistence between Muslims and Christians in that order. In any case, they failed. But their failure is also connected to the Israeli project in Lebanon, because the Israeli state thought that it could actually create a Lebanese state that is a puppet regime that is ruled by the Phalange. You know, so that's what they support after their invasion in 82. They support Bashir Ismail, who's put in power, you know, and elected president. Then, of course, he's assassinated by members of the Syrian SSNP, the Syrian Social Progressive Party, which we've referred to in many cases before. And of course, we've referred to their record. They're very much capable of doing assassinations when they want to, you know, as we know from previous episodes. So they take out Bashir Ismail, and that right after that, you end up with Sabra and Shatila, but you also end up with new waves of fighting, and the country does descend into war. There's even internal Christian fighting that happens after that, because internally it's a total mess. And in the meantime, Syria is operating, it enters, increases its operations. Now, the variable that is much more interesting for us for the present that comes in is that the Shia population now is moving from operating under the leftist banner towards operating under an Islamic one. This continues, you know, throughout the 80s, and it's very ugly. You know, there's multiple fights that happen in the 80s. Some of them actually still involve Palestinians after 82, because what many listeners don't know is that Arafat tries to make a comeback even after 82. and even after you have Sabra and Shatila. So he goes back and secretly resurfaces in Tripoli in the north of Lebanon. And it's Hafiz al-Assad and his associated forces that ensure that he's thrown out. Because Yasser Arafat was trying to reintroduce the Palestinian presence into Lebanon by coming back and by, again, rearming the people of the camps, the Palestinian refugees in the refugee camps in Lebanon, which had always been, by the way, of course, the strongest force in the Palestinian Revolution during its period in Lebanon. So that fails, but then right after, the Syrians waged this horrific campaign, which is known as the War of the Camps. And it intensifies, and it becomes basically a war over the control of the Palestinian people. Are they going to be aligned with the PLO leadership under Yasser Arafat, or are they going to fall under the control of Hafiz al-Assad through Palestinian parties that have now become affiliated with him? And this becomes very ugly because Hafiz al-Assad uses a Shiite sectarian group, Amal, to carry out this mission. They start attacking the Palestinian refugee camps. It was a very difficult period, actually, in modern Palestinian history, the War of the Camps. A lot of people died out of starvation and siege, and including, actually, in brutalized areas like Sabra and Shatila themselves. And, there's, in the Palestinian political calendar, there's many events relating to that, and major symbolic figures that are sometimes forgotten. Ali Abu To, in particular, was a big figure in this period, and there's many others that are less well known that fought in that context. Now, that creates a set, like one of the theaters of war. The Palestinian question is not resolved. Who's going to control the Palestinian voice in Lebanon becomes a big issue. Then you have another dimension to the war that persists in the 80s, which is, as we mentioned, what's going to be the line between the Druze and Maronite villages in the mountain, and here you have this push to on each side to expand, and it results with Druze control taking place over a set of strategic villages, but it comes at a very heavy human cost, of course. And then you have multiple other theaters of operation. We can't get to all of them, Daniel. What ends the situation is political settlement that is essentially sponsored by Saudi Arabia during something that was called the Ta'if Agreements. Ta'if is a city in the Hijaz in Saudi Arabia, and essentially the Saudis are coming in heavy during this period in terms of their involvement in Lebanese politics. They broker this deal, which essentially is centered around something that was called وثيقة وفاق وطني, like a national reconciliation accord. وثيقة الوفاق الوطني. This takes place. This happens. It gets signed in October 1989. So the essential aspect of this agreement was that it basically said that we're going to have a situation where there's no clear victor here, but that there's going to be a principle, which is the principle of mutual coexistence coming in operation. So in many ways, this agreement was a blow to the Maronite separatist project, which had been espoused by some movements within the Maronite political scene, by no means all, but by some. Then you had also this big set of negotiations on how you're going to have the distribution of political power taking place. And again, in this agreement, essentially the previous order, which had favored the Maronite population in the country politically in terms of its the chunk of political power that it had changed. So their position had been weakened. Now, there was another dimension, which is that you had disarming of militias. during this period. And that was an important aspect of this agreement. But significantly, because the Lebanese South was still occupied by the Israeli state, one group continued to be allowed to be armed, which is, of course, Hezbollah. And that becomes a major element because it was saying, look, we're a resistance organization. We're fighting the Israelis. We're not fighting the internal Lebanese battles.
Israel maintained its occupation of southern Lebanon for 18 years, from the 1982 invasion until 2000, when Israel finally withdrew under massive pressure from Hezbollah. Hezbollah, or Party of God, a Shia resistance army and political party, it was founded in 1982 to fight the Israeli occupation and of course also ultimately became a dominant political and military force in Lebanon that would fight a major war with Israel in 2006 and then again today, fighting in support, in solidarity with Gaza. How did Hezbollah emerge in the 1980s amid civil war, Israeli occupation, and also this huge socioeconomic dislocation occasioned by the mass urbanization in Beirut of Shia peasantry from the south? What was the social and class composition of Hezbollah's base? How did that base and more generally the space that Hezbollah took up in Lebanese politics, how did that all compare to previously ascendant left-wing forces like the Lebanese Communist Party or the Lebanese National Movement? And then lastly, how did Hezbollah compare and relate to the other major Shia movement, the Amal movement, which emerged before Hezbollah in the early years of the Civil War amid Israeli invasions of the South? All of this was happening, of course, in the wake of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which had provided a new non-secular leftist idiom and model for Arab anti-imperialist and social justice politics.
All right. So, Daniel, these are excellent questions, and I think they're particularly topical given the situation that we're confronting today. Let's start by looking at the class and social base upon which these movements rely. In the case of Hezbollah, obviously, it was an officially Shia movement, which meant that it established itself along the traditional Lebanese sectarian lines. Now, that is quite significant for reasons that have to do with the history of the Shiite population in Lebanon, which was a marginalized population historically that was primarily centered in the south of Lebanon. Its historic base was a region known previously as Jabal Amil, and that region, of course, was the site of the Fida'i actions that we spoke about in previous episodes, the actions of the Palestinian Revolution. The majority of Shia sons and daughters of the South were farmers. They were small farmers. There was a set of semi-feudal relations operating there as well. There were two big families that owned a lot of land and that controlled politics in the South. Due to the economic marginality of this community, it was, of course, completely put to the side when it came to the original setup of the Lebanese political formula by the French colonial forces. What happened was the Maronite population was given the biggest share in the government of the country. The Sunni population essentially emerged as a kind of a junior partner, but with substantial weight. And the Shia population was essentially ignored, although they were given some symbolic positions. I mean, in particular, the Speaker of the Parliament was reserved for them. But in general, what you had was a population that was very much drawn to working class politics as a result of its economic and political marginality. And that's why it joined radical movements in large numbers. The Lebanese Communist Party drew on a base that very much came from the south to a large extent, although, of course, as a secular party, it had other social groups joining it. The different Arab nationalist movements and the Ba'ath and the movement of Arab nationalists also recruited heavily in the south of Lebanon. Even Fatah, which was a Palestinian movement, recruited heavily in the south of Lebanon. And definitely there was a very large number of Shiite Lebanese from the south that had trained, fought, and in many cases died as part of the Palestinian Revolution. So these are all facts that are important to consider when we look at what happens from the 1970s onwards, which is the emergence of parties that particularly organize along sectarian lines rather than internationalist or Arabist lines of the sort that we've seen before in this particular region and amongst this particular religious sect. Amal is the first. I mean, it starts with the arrival of an Iranian cleric who becomes very influential in Lebanese politics, Musa Sadr, even though Arabic was not his first language, and definitely Lebanon was not his home community. He was able to utilize a certain religious prestige to be able to galvanize a force around him, and with time he grew in power and achieved greater prominence in his movement, which started as the movement of the disadvantaged, or Harakat al-Mahrumin, eventually became the basis for the later formation of the Amal movement, of course. Now, Musa Sadr eventually disappears from the political scene. It's widely suspected that he was assassinated by Gaddafi in Libya, but that's a side story that we're not going to focus on. The most important fact to note here is that you have a situation where there was a debate around the time of his disappearance on where to go next within Shia circles. Politically, I'm talking, because he had disappeared in 1978, and of course those were the years that witnessed the lead up to the Iranian Revolution and the social mobilizations around it, and of course you had Ayatollah Khomeini emerging as the dominant figure there. And we spoke before about the main ideology that he was promoting, which was the idea of wilayat al-faqih. This idea of the rule of the jurist, the rule of the cleric, becomes very important. Those that decided to follow and adopt that idea in a more committed manner eventually formed the nucleus that was to morph into Hezbollah. These were people that had been inspired by the Iranian Revolution, that had been inspired by the figure of Imam Khomeini, that saw the future organizing in Lebanon is connected to that, and that, of course, had received, as a result, direct support from the new revolutionary state that had been established in Iran. And over the years, that support only grew, and that organic relationship developed further and further. Now, some people characterize this relationship as simply one based on Iran controlling a pliant local force in Lebanon. It's more complicated than that because there were reasons why this social force developed. In a country in which every sect had a sectarian representation, it was only natural that eventually you were going to have a specific type of Shia party emerging. And in an atmosphere like that of the 1980s, it was only natural that this would take the form of a religious-based politics rather than the secular politics that had predominated amongst the Shia population in the South previously. Now, the other dimension that was really significant here was that, of course, you had long-standing relations between members of the Iranian higher echelons in the post-revolutionary period and Lebanese cadres from the South, because many of the leaders of the Iranian Revolution had actually trained in the Lebanese South, either with the PLO or through other bodies, and they formed relationships. They had exchanges before. This is not to mention the religious exchanges that had existed amongst the clerics of the South and Iranian clerics. They had their own relationship through religious networks, and many of them had met together either in Najaf or in Iran itself. So there you had this connection that was very strong. Now, what Hezbollah does initially upon its early formative years, we can definitely say that you had something operating along the sort of ideological lines that we were talking about in Lebanon as a result of the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. So you started having the beginnings of an Islamic-based resistance. Rather, and this is very important, this was posited as an alternative to the sectarian-based organizing that Amal was pursuing. So both Hezbollah and Amal share the fact that they focus on one particular sect, i.e. they're playing within the rules of the sectarian game. However, the sectarian game in Lebanon is traditionally pursued by pragmatic politicians, not ideologues. These are not ideological parties. These are parties that state that their main objective is to further the interests of their sect and so on and so forth. Hezbollah had a bigger idea than that. It's talking about cataclysmic events that go way beyond that. It's talking about events that have to do with the salvation of humanity. It's actually announcing itself as the party of God. So it is saying, look, we're following here a major and incredible revolution that just took place, the Iranian Revolution, and it's going to unleash a new phase in how things work for humanity as a whole, but certainly for this region. And that includes following, of course, the rulings of the jurist, but also establishing an alternative social model. What does Hezbollah do when it comes to its alternative social model? It establishes a deep social base in the Lebanese South, provides welfare institutions. It gains a reputation for credibility there, which in a way, by the way, would have been the ideal scenario for the revolutionaries that had been inspired by Marxism and other secular ideologies in the past. If you do want to establish a strong base for guerrilla operations anywhere, you'd want to have a very strong social base with you in that area. And you'd want to have the loyalty in that area strengthened. This was especially important in a region like the South, which had been heavily infiltrated by the Israelis at this stage. So one challenge that Hezbollah needed to address in this period was how to win over the local population. And that doesn't just mean mobilizing for the party. It also means presenting the party as credible to non-party members and saying, look, you'll benefit if Hezbollah is in control of your area. And of course, in this case, Hezbollah had the advantage of having a state sponsor, which was Iran, that could fund this project. It had a lot to gain from Iran, but also it had something to give to Iran, and we'll talk about that in a second. The second issue that Hezbollah needed to deal with, aside from confronting this Israeli infiltration and winning over the local population to its side in the face of that project, was to achieve a certain sort of monopoly on resistance within the areas of the South. If we speak in Weberian terms, often people talk about monopoly on violence as a feature of the state formation and so on. When we look at a movement like that of Hezbollah, what they were opting for is not a monopoly on violence. They wanted monopoly on resistance. That notion of resistance, not just the act of resistance, which meant that they needed to marginalize the Communist Party, which was very strong in Shia areas in the past. They needed to marginalize the Baathists and the various Arab nationalists. They needed to create a space in which they appear as the only credible power that is confronting the Israeli colonial project and its expansion in Lebanon. And remember, all of this is happening to the backdrop of the Israeli occupation of the Lebanese or much of the Lebanese South throughout this period. And, it happens in direct and indirect forms from the mid-70s onwards. They're starting to plant their agents and they're starting to create social fissures. And then, as we talked about this before, in 78, they come in and actually enter Lebanese territory in the south and go to the Litani and then leave some of their agents behind. And later on in Beirut, in the siege during the siege of Beirut in 82, they go all the way up to the Lebanese capital. So there needed to be a resistance structure that fights them. And the question was, okay, who's going to carry out the resistance? Now, initially, the call for resistance comes not from the religious movements, it comes from the Lebanese national movement itself, the old secular formations that we spoke about earlier. They made the announcement, and of course, it was signed and announced by Mohsen Ibrahim, one of the characters that we talked about before, alongside, of course, representatives of the communists. You had people like Zor Zahawi and others that were very involved as well in this period. You had all of these classical names that made this call to fight. And we have good sources on this. I mean, people like Fawaz Bulsi and others have written about this in their memoirs. The question of, okay, what happens next? Who's going to carry that mantle for the long haul? Ultimately, it's movements that will receive the adequate arming and that have the necessary funding and that have access to a social base that could carry out the operations. Those movements emerge as victorious. And in this case, actually, it's Hezbollah, essentially. What we see after Ta'if, the Ta'if agreements that we mentioned earlier, where that led to the conclusion of the war, one of the main gains that Hezbollah achieves during the Ta'if agreements is that it is basically said there that the resistance in the south is exempt from the rule of having to hand over their weapons and to lose their militia status. So by the conclusion of the civil war, they're the only body that has a legitimate possession of weapons in the country, aside from the army. Everybody else, if they're storing weapons or so on, that's not in accordance with the rules of the Ta'if agreement. But they come out as a group that has a mandate to liberate the territory in the south. That they do after a long and very strong battle that lasted until the beginning of the new millennium. But by the time this, the Israeli withdrawal comes with the onset of the new millennium, you have the situation where Hezbollah emerges as the paramount force that cannot be challenged in the south, militarily at least.
I'm Aziz Rana, and you're listening to The Dig, a great place for analysis about where we are, how we got here, and what can be done. It's my favorite podcast, and you can support it at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by University of California Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Wannabe Fascists by Federico Finkelstein. This book offers a precise explanation of why Trumpism and similar movements belong to a new political breed, the wannabe fascists. Drawing on almost 3 decades of research on the histories of fascism and populism around the world, the Wannabe Fascists lays out the 4 pillars of fascism: xenophobia, propaganda, political violence, and, ultimately, dictatorship. Finkelstein explains how and why wannabe fascists like Trump, Bolsonaro, and Modi embrace the first 3 pillars, but don't quite succeed in the 4th. This book stresses the importance of preventing despots from reaching this tipping point and offers a clear warning for what's at stake. Learn more about the Wannabe Fascists at UCPress.edu. In 1991, the U.S. led its first invasion of Iraq, and that was after Iraq had, of course, in 1990, invaded and occupied neighboring Kuwait. But before we get into the politics behind and the giant consequences of the U.S.-led invasion, let's discuss Iraq and its invasion of Kuwait. Once upon a time, as Thawra listeners know, union with Iraq had been a dream shared by Arab nationalists on both sides of the border. But what was it that motivated Iraq's invasion of Kuwait under the government of Saddam Hussein? After all, the Ba'ath Party was founded above all else as an anti-imperialist nationalist party. But under Saddam Hussein, Iraq had become a Western ally in its war against Iran. What do we need to understand about Iraq and also the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, what it had become in the years since it had seized power, since the Ba'ath Party had seized power in 1968 through the Iran-Iraq War? What domestic and geopolitical factors explain the decision to invade Kuwait?
This is a story that's very much connected, of course, to the Iran-Iraq War. But of course, there are longer-term issues relating to Iraq's claim on Kuwait. Historically, the claim was based on the idea that Kuwait was essentially under the control of the Ottoman governor of Basra, and that it essentially floated in Basra's orbit. And later on, the British come in and they sign an agreement with al-Sabah, local ruler there, and he illegitimately exits from the realm of the control of Basra and enters into a special separate deal with the British. That's the Iraqi line on this. So they're blaming British colonialism for separating Kuwait from Iraq. What's interesting about this line, and about, by the way, the counter Kuwaiti claim, which is usually based on saying, well, we've always had some level of autonomy. We've had dealings with the British East India Company before. We've had dealings with various bodies, that were independent of the governor of Basra. And, it's a very technical conversation, actually. But the honest truth is, what's interesting about this is the status of Kuwait in relation to Basra only becomes of interest after the discovery of oil. Before the discovery of oil, it was the Kuwaiti side that was very keen on being part of Iraq. And here I'm not referring to the ruling family. I'm referring to certain mercantile families that owned date palms in the Basra district, and they were from Kuwait, that were unhappy about this border that was emerging and unhappy about the regional dynamics that emerged after the British came in and set up a separate kingdom of Iraq, and that felt that their economic interests were threatened by the emergence of new Iraqi citizenship laws that they did not benefit from as residents of Kuwait. And these families also were worried about the crisis of water. And now that Kuwait had been split from Iraq, and they felt that with the establishment of these modern boundaries, Kuwait had very little access to water compared to Iraq, of course. And the water of Shatt al-Arab, which is, of course, the product of the meeting of the Euphrates and Tigris, was abundant, and it could have, helped Kuwait through its general water crisis. So that was the original orientation. Now, after the discovery of oil, things change, because it's no longer the ruling family only that has an interest in maintaining a separate political sovereignty. It's the whole population that has Kuwaiti citizenship, which is an exclusive club. Only people that had been part of the Kuwaiti founding body politic enjoyed that right, or people that were given special exemptions by the ruling family. I'll give you a small example. There were more than 400,000 Palestinians in Kuwait, for example, from, it's a community that formed after the Nakba, and that was the most important foreign group in Kuwait until Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and the expulsion of the majority of this population. But out of this 400,000 Palestinians, only 50 families were actually given Kuwaiti citizenship. So it was very difficult to get that citizenship. You can see why. If you had that citizenship, you got immense benefits. You got lots of free services. And to this day, you get like good welfare state kind of provisions through having that citizenship, and you get all sorts of privileges. So the maintaining of an exclusive nationality order and a citizenship order becomes very, very important because it's tied to economic benefits. Now, let's say Kuwait were to become part of Iraq, instead of a few 100,000 people at the time, sharing these resources, they'd have to share it with a population that is 30 times bigger, 25 times bigger. It's an economic no-brainer that you wouldn't want to do that. And the same goes for the other Gulf states that have had a situation where they've had access to major oil resources. So a place like Emirates or Qatar don't have much incentive to share in the oil. But of course, for governments like the government of Iraq, there is an interest in this oil. And that interest becomes more significant if you've come out of a situation of war, which is the situation that Iraq had emerged out of by the late 1980s. Now, of course, Iraq had made a bid on Kuwait earlier under Abdel Karim Qasim. And we know that actually that bid was not only sabotaged by the British, but also by Gamal Abdel Nasser himself, who said that, which might be quite ironic for listeners because they might think, well, Abdel Nasser would want Arab unity, but no, he said that it should be by consent, it should not be forced. In the case of the post-Iran-Iraq war situation, the Iraqis felt that they were protecting the whole Gulf, and that they lost. Saddam thought, look, I put my whole army in the service of these Gulf rulers. I invested a lot of human resources into this massive death toll, huge capital loss. And at the same time, there was a feeling that the oil prices were too low, partly because Gulf states like Kuwait were not adequately cutting production. There was a feeling also that they were intentionally sabotaging Iraq's reconstruction efforts by tapping into shared oil fields, particularly Rumaila oil field, and that Iraq was losing too much of that oil field as a result of over drilling and overproduction on the Kuwaiti side. So Saddam had according to his version of events, made multiple requests, and he was snubbed. Ultimately, he decided that he's going to make this move. And in Arab circles, it is widely believed that, the U.S. gave a green light to it. And there's good grounds for this belief because the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad at the time, when Saddam pretty much asked her what the U.S. would think about a move of that sort, did not actually, offer protest to it. So, which is a signal, and it was taken by Saddam as a signal. It was definitely a miscalculation on his part because he felt that, okay, the main superpower is okay with me invading. Usually, if the U.S. has a problem with these things, these matters are treated very seriously. If you have a ruler that just came out of a war, essentially probing whether an invasion would be viewed with favor by the U.S., you'd have an immediate no from the ambassador. You'd have a very strict answer. But what was interesting at this time is that the invasion took place under these circumstances. It was promoted in Arab nationalist circles as a Bismarckian move that could lead to further Arab unity.
As a just challenge to colonial imposed borders. And Saddam Hussein at this time, Egypt had just been readmitted to the Arab League, from which it had been expelled for recognizing Israel. Syria was kind of reestablishing relationships across the region. Saddam Hussein was sort of presenting himself as the last great Arab leader.
Right. That image had actually been promoted by the Gulf states throughout the period of his war with Iran. You know, he was presented as a great leader. He was presented as the sword of the Arabs. This was the title that they often bestowed upon him in this period.
A champion of the Palestinian cause.
This was absolutely essential to his myth during the invasion of Kuwait. I mean, what he did was he said, and you know, this was a situation after he invaded and took over Kuwait. He really focused on Palestine in this context. So he said, look, I'll withdraw if Israel withdraws from the occupied territories. He said that he made statements, threatening the Israelis, and he even bombed the Israelis, of course, with missiles that were not going to do that much damage. I mean, they were Scud missiles.
Scud missiles, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, not directed at precise targets, but they did do some damage, and there was a lot of media fanfare around it. Daniel, you have to understand, in Palestinian circles, people were desperate at this stage, and they were angry at the Gulf governments at this stage, especially in the occupied territories, but also in Jordan. These were the years of the First Intifada. It was still raging at the time. It was still going on, and yet there was no action, serious action on the part of Arab states in this period, especially Gulf states. Since the siege of Beirut, there was no serious intervention on the part of Gulf states. There was a lot of resentment towards Saudi Arabia in particular, under King Fahd. There was essentially this feeling that the cause had been abandoned completely. And here comes Saddam, who had also been promoted on Jordanian TV, which is essentially what is shown to the majority of Palestinians. Jordan has a huge Palestinian population, but also the West Bank gets Jordan TV. And of course, that population there follows it. And for years, Saddam was presented as a great liberator in that television because, of course, King Hussein of Jordan had interestingly developed a strong alliance with Saddam. You might find this weird, given the fact that, you know, Saddam, of course, and the Ba'ath presented themselves as holding the Republican revolutionary legacy of the revolution in Iraq that overthrew the Hashemite monarchy there. But politics is politics, and Saddam ultimately treated King Hussein much better than Gulf rulers did. And this is something that is very clear. And, we see a situation where, you know, Saddam had a great deal of popularity in Jordan. He had reasons to establish a strong alliance with Jordan because, of course, during his war with Iran, he could no longer use the Gulf as a reliable shipping route, and therefore he needed to rely on the port of Aqaba to do this, especially given the fact that his relationship with the Syrians was really terrible. And of course, there was no economic exchange between Iraq and Syria in that period. Syria, for reasons that we may or may not wish to discuss, ended up actually allying with Iran at this stage. So Saddam essentially needed to establish a strong relationship with Jordan, and the Jordanian monarchy and the state benefited immensely from that relationship. All of Iraq's shipping, and Iraq is a much bigger country with far greater wealth, much of it was passing through Jordan, through the port of Aqaba, and then trailers would take it. These trucks would take it all the way to Baghdad. Would take the products all the way to Baghdad, and you had Jordan's oil was subsidized by Iraq at this stage. So King Hussein of Jordan was promoting Saddam in these settings, and certainly there was a focus in the media on Saddam's pro-Palestinian role. This puts actually also the Palestinian revolutionary leadership under a lot of pressure to ally with him. And that in Palestinian circles to this day is a major, major subject of contention and anger. A lot of people consider that Yasser Arafat's decision to essentially endorse Saddam eventually, even though, by the way, it was taken after a lot of hesitation and it was taken under a very specific set of circumstances, a lot of them consider it to have been disastrous because it led to the destruction of the Palestinian community in Kuwait after Saddam was ousted.
And at the risk of going down too much a rabbit hole, I think we should take a very quick minute to explain why Syria sided with Iran over Iraq. This is Ba'athist Syria siding with Iran over Ba'athist Iraq, which suggests that by this point, an issue we've returned to many, many times, both Ba'athist parties are extraordinarily deformed thanks to their military takeover, deformed in terms of what the party's founders initially envisioned.
When we look at the relationship between the Syrian and Iraqi Ba'ath, it was never that great, as we know from previous episodes. And of course, there was intense competition between these two wings of the Ba'ath party. But in the 1970s, the situation becomes more interesting because you have two strongmen emerging within these parties actually achieve a situation of stability of rule for these parties in their respective states. So we have Hafiz al-Assad, of course, in Syria, emerging in Syria, and Saddam emerging in Iraq. We spoke about the peculiarities of this. Both come from minority communities within these countries, but in one case, it's a religious Alawi minority. In the case of Syria, it's a religious Sunni minority. In case of Iraq, we don't want to over-sectarianize. We always say this in the dig, but it's an element of the equation that is important to consider. And both of them are essentially trying to think about their position and the position of their respective countries on the regional map. Now, after the Iranian Revolution, Iraq has to decide on what is to be done, given the fact that you have an extremely large state that has just undergone a revolutionary transformation. It's right next door. It shares an extremely long boundary with Iraq. And this state is part of its official policy is to export revolution. And in here, it's particularly targeting Iraq. And it's targeting Iraq on a sectarian basis. It's focusing on a Shiite population in the south. So Saddam sees this in existential terms. This is a major, major threat. It's a threat to Iraq's sovereignty. It's a threat to his ruling order. It's a threat on multiple levels. It's a threat to the ideologies that he subscribed to. It's the most serious threat that he's ever confronted in his entire political trajectory. One option would have been to confront this, would have been to increase the strategic depth of Iraq in relation to Iran, both in terms of the size of the population, but also in terms of access to ports, in particular the Mediterranean, and access also to a different demographic balance, which is why Saddam's, relative who was officially in power, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, was interested in arriving at an agreement with Hafiz al-Assad. And he was saying, look, a unity agreement with Syria would solve a lot of these issues. Syria has the opposite situation to Iraq. It has a large Sunni majority and a small Shia minority of a different, and also actually the Alawis belong to a different Shia sect, and of course the 12 Imam Ja'faris that represent Iran. So the demographic and sectarian balance there is very different. This would have been beneficial from an Iraqi standpoint in relation to this new threat, would have also fulfilled the needs of the Ba'ath at the time, the ideological proclamations of it.
Arab solidarity against a Persian threat rather than a sectarian Sunni Shia basis for the division.
Right. And then at the same time, from the Syrian angle, Hafiz had stuff to gain. Syria had a serious set of economic needs that needed to be addressed, and it could have benefited heavily from Iraqi oil. It had a serious Israeli threat towards it. Remember this particular moment, you have a regional map that is quickly changing, and the Israelis are becoming more and more and more aggressive. And it's clear that they're putting a lot of pressure on Syria, and and not the least through Lebanon. So you have all sorts of considerations that could have been beneficial for both parties in this regard. In any case, these unity talks eventually get shelved. Why? Because it's precisely in the context of these unity talks that Saddam comes in and takes over power and removes essentially the government of his relative Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. Now, this happens in 1979, precisely at this moment when the region has witnessed all of these changes. The removal of Ahmed Hassan Bakr comes as a shock to Hafiz al-Assad. It's accompanied by a serious set of purges within the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, public purges, actually quite terrible ones. Saddam sends his comrades to death in horrific ways, actually, in a party conference that is quite notorious. And he essentially is saying, look, we're not going to have an arrangement where Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr is president and then Hafiz is vice president, and I'm no longer vice president. I get marginalized in this equation. But also he has suspicions of Hafiz. He felt that he was playing his cousin, his relative. And ultimately, they end up essentially, Syria and Iraq moved from a situation where they were almost on the verge of potential unity to a situation of crazy warfare, potential eruption of warfare. Of course, it doesn't descend to that, but it becomes a very serious situation of total rupture between them. And here, you have accusations from Syria, of course, that Saddam is aiding Islamic insurgency there that we talked about earlier. And of course, Saddam is accusing Hafiz of supporting Iranian state against its Arab neighbor. So you could not actually travel between Syria and Iraq at this stage. There was a lot of repression around anyone suspected of having connections between the two countries. You have incidents taking place in other countries, in third countries. In Lebanon, for example, the Iraqi embassy is destroyed. There's all sorts of operations and hostilities that are unleashed between the two states at this stage. And for Hafiz al-Assad, the strategic choice, now that the Iranian Revolution was victorious and now that the Iraqi option was no longer available, not that we can't even be sure that he was ever serious about the Iraqi option. Maybe he was buying time. That was at least Saddam's theory. But they now that these options were no longer available, an alliance with Iran makes sense. This was the best option available for the Syrians at this stage.
Let's turn to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in the first Gulf War, particularly how that fits in to this longer history of the development of a powerful American military presence in the region, a presence that dates back to the U.S. Dhahran Air Base in Saudi Arabia, built in 1945. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had declared, quote, "The defense of Saudi Arabia is vital to the defense of the United States." This history of U.S. military power and more generally of intervention in the Middle East, it moves on through so many events that we've touched on. The CIA orchestrated Syrian coup in 1949, the U.S.-UK 1953 coup in Iran, the 1950s attempt to construct the Western-aligned Baghdad military pact, the proclamation of the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957, and the subsequent landing of U.S. Marines in Lebanon in 1958, all the way through the 1980 proclamation of the Carter Doctrine, announced after the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah's regime, which, of course, was one of the region's key Western proxy forces. President Jimmy Carter announced in his State of the Union address in January 1980, quote, "An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. Then the Iran-Iraq War, which we discussed at great length earlier, with the U.S. backing Iraq but playing both sides, and also, in addition, directly sending naval forces to protect Kuwaiti oil tankers from Iranian attack, lay out how this grand sweep brings the U.S. military presence in the Middle East to the point that it's at in the first Gulf War, when U.S. troops mass in the region and then invade?
It's a very apt question, and I think it's very important to tie it to previous discussions we've had in previous episodes. In particular, we should here think about why the U.S. was not directly involved in the past, except in the case of Saudi Arabia, where it did have the Dhahran base that you mentioned. Let's not forget that up until the British withdrawal from the Gulf, Britain played the role of ensuring defense protection for the small states of the Gulf, stretching from Kuwait all the way down to the Yemeni borders, all the way down to Oman. And we've seen throughout the previous episodes how the British carried out this task, including through actually confronting domestic revolutionary forces that tried to challenge the existing regimes, especially in the case of Oman, but also elsewhere. They played this role of suppressing dissent locally while ensuring the perpetuation of the existing ruling families and dynasties in these different areas. And of course, these ruling families and dynasties were connected organically to the Western ruling order in the region. Now, with British withdrawal, we end up having a situation where the US has to rethink what's going on. And here we're talking about the decade of the 70s. You know, the decade begins with the British withdrawal, and then the rest of the decade has to do with the US figuring out how to fill that void. The newly independent states that emerged after the British withdrawal were generally hesitant to house major US bases, at least in public, because there was still a situation where we had the residues of the previous attempts to create an Arab regional defense system that was independent of direct Western control and that was non-aligned in orientation. That was, in essence, at the heart of the nationalist project, but also it was at the heart of other major patriotic and nationalist movements that had emerged in the region during this time. So you can view the entirety of modern Arab history, at least the political side of it, in part as a struggle against this kind of establishment of foreign military bases and entanglement in foreign military alliances. In many ways, that's a big aspect of that story. This is why in the 1950s, you can't understand the whole decade without thinking about the Baghdad Pact. But what is the Baghdad Pact? The Baghdad Pact, at the end of the day, is the reality we're seeing today. Nasser defeats it in the 50s, but the Americans somehow bring it back under a different guise. And in fact, even a more direct guise in the post-1970s world. Now, initially, in the 1970s, they could afford not to be directly involved in the small states that had just emerged after British withdrawal, because they could adopt a twin pillar approach that depended on Saudi Arabia and Iran, anchoring security in the oil-rich Gulf region. And by the way, notice, and this is very important for many discussions around the role of Israel in the Middle East. Unfortunately, many analysts and commentators, will repeat the Israeli-generated line that Israel is important for the security of oil. Actually, in this period, and even in subsequent periods, and remember, this is even after '67, Israel has no role to play because it's actually Saudi Arabians, Iranians, that are playing this role through direct presence, You have an American naval presence that could reach this area, and also you have direct and indirect ways of ensuring the perpetuation of security arrangements there. Did not require Israeli troops or Israeli presence or anything like that. So at this stage, they're using this method. Who are they protecting this region from? In the 60s, it was really about preventing the spread of Nasserism and the spread of anti-colonial ideas. In the 70s, they're wary about Iraq to some extent, but there's no serious direct threat, okay, aside from revolutionary local movements like the Thawra Revolution and others. So by the time we get to the 80s, however, we have a new regional map. The fall of Iran is a disaster for the US. They no longer have a local policeman to act on their behalf in the region in the figure of the Shah. And their whole edifice of control had, in a way, taken a huge hit. And yes, the traditional global opponent, the Soviet Union, had been significantly weakened at this stage. But at the same time, there were still tasks connected to it, Cold War tasks, that needed to be carried out, particularly in this case in Afghanistan. So you have a very complicated regional map developing in the 1980s. And that map will allow for far greater US intervention than ever before. Still, this intervention has limits. There was hesitation, for example, on the part of Kuwait to house American bases. Kuwait did not want them. There was hesitation on the part of even the Emiratis under Sheikh Zayed at the stage to be seen as operating within that logic. You still did not see Qatar turning into basically one mega US base. The only government that was really cooperating on a big scale out of in the southern Gulf was Oman, which allowed the US to establish some presence in Masira and elsewhere. So we have this situation where the US is beginning to enter outside of its traditional stronghold, which is Saudi Arabia. It's beginning to expand elsewhere, but it's having to recalibrate its position in the region, especially after the loss of Iran under the Shah. Now, what do they do next? Of course, they're supporting this big war that we talked about, the Iran-Iraq war, and they're definitely arming Iraq and encouraging it to attack, but they were also covertly arming Iran and also helping it to perpetuate the war in many ways. And this essentially neutralizes both the Iranian and the Iraqi threat to the oil-rich region that the US is so concerned with. They don't want an independent actor to control that region, an independent local actor. But by the time the war ends and Saddam emerges out of that war with an exhausted Iraqi economy, with a situation where the rebuilding of the country will require much better oil prices than those that the economy of the 80s was allowing for. Anybody who comes from an oil-producing region or lives in one will know that the 1980s were tough for oil-producing regions, including here in the United States. I mean, I'm talking to you now, Daniel, from Houston, Texas, where the whole real estate market, for example, collapsed in the 80s because of the oil crisis. And you had a very difficult situation. The oil prices were so low at that time. So Iraq needed to reconstruct in that environment. Now, they besieged the Gulf states, including Kuwait, to try to restrict production and so on and so forth. It didn't work out. In fact, besides overproduction, they were facing, as we mentioned earlier, oil being taken out of a joint field that they had with Kuwait, which is Rumaila. So what happens next? We end up with the Gulf War. Now, during the Gulf War, and this is something that it should have been asked very seriously, Saddam decides to invade Kuwait, yes. But then quickly, Saddam is confronted with a situation where he realizes that what he thought was American approval or at least a green light, or at least a yellow light, or maybe turning a blind eye, whatever you want to call it, was essentially a trick. There was no approval. In fact, what he was going to get was the Americans coming in and building a massive global coalition around them that would depend on support from multiple powers. And this was very risky for Iraq. Iraq could not confront that sort of military force. It did not have the weaponry. It did not have the army. Of course, Saddam's propaganda machine at the time, and I was even subjected to it as a kid because I was like many people, I was living in Jordan at the time. People in Jordan and Palestine and elsewhere were being fed this information saying, well, Iraq has thousands of tanks. The Americans have only 1,000 tanks in the region. Iraq has 5,000. I remember those statistics. They would throw at you all these numbers. And they'd be like, yeah, maybe they'll win in an air war, but when it comes to the ground war, they'll lose. And which is, of course, not true. At the end of the day, Iraq is a smaller country. It's one of the bigger Middle Eastern states, but in the global military order, it cannot confront superpowers that are amassing at a major scale there. Not with a traditional army, definitely. I mean, maybe they engaged in guerrilla tactics or something. But in any case, Saddam knew that. But he was in a difficult situation. He was desperate for a diplomatic solution out. And his friend, King Hussein, was trying very hard to find a way to achieve such a solution. And, you had others that were trying to work towards that, like Yasser Arafat even, and others. You had this situation. But the Americans were not interested. They were not giving a formula where Iraq could save face and withdraw from Kuwait. They wanted military intervention. I really believe this, Daniel. There could have been a diplomatic way to get him out. But the intention was to destroy and completely attack Iraq in significant ways at this stage.
For the U.S., this was a demonstration project to inaugurate what George H.W. Bush called the New World Order.
Correct. And this New World Order would basically involve the idea that no longer the bipolar world that had existed in the past is now a unipolar world. Iraq quickly found out that its old Soviet ally could not be relied upon to save it in this situation. The Americans wanted to come in hard because, of course, this was a moment to actually establish full control over the whole region. They now had bases everywhere. They now had a situation, an opportunity to come in as, the number one power in the region in terms of not only influence, but in terms of also direct military presence. And I think this is very important for us to remember. There is a direct military presence, American presence in this region that is extensive and that continues to be there. And to this very day, if you look at the region's map, it is one gigantic American base. Every little corner has American bases in it there. And really, the Gulf War is a turning point in that regard. Now, there is no question, of course, and we've listened, for listeners of the Dig, we went in depth into this, about Saddam's dictatorship and where it comes from. And of course, we talk about these things with a great deal of historical nuance in this podcast. Elsewhere in the American media and so on, they just picked on bits and pieces and turned it into a big propaganda assault to justify this course of action, which is to choose war as the way forward to end the occupation of Kuwait. The occupation of Kuwait was not a nice affair on the part of Saddam. Kuwaitis that suffered throughout this episode of history, a lot of them had lost a lot of their possessions. A lot of them had to be housed elsewhere, and so on. A lot of them became temporarily refugees. So this situation was by no means, a lovely action on the part of Saddam. But what the Americans did was create a situation which really led to a humanitarian disaster in Iraq and to a political disaster across the region. What we had was a direct assault on regional sovereignty that resulted from this. Now, Iraq is forced out militarily, of course. And then after it's forced out militarily, the propaganda lines that were used, highlighting Saddam's dictatorship and violations and so on, suddenly all the crimes of Saddam get remembered. They had been omitted, they had been even facilitated by the United States before, including something like the Halabja massacres, which led to death on a mass scale in the Kurdish areas through the use of weapons of mass destruction. But you have these crimes that suddenly resurface and they're talked about. And what's of course omitted is that they were facilitated with U.S. supplied weaponry, and the U.S. turned a blind eye to them. We have mentioned about Saddam's dictatorship, and you have all these books that appear in the 1980s, Republic of Fear, all of these books that come out at the time, highlighting Saddam's egregious human rights abuses and dictatorship. We've known about that for a long time. Why at that moment? It doesn't make it untrue. These abuses, many of them did take place, and they were horrific, but they were selectively chosen at the time to justify actually a regime of abuse against the Iraqi people, which was the sanctions regime, which led to massive hunger in Iraq. And accompanied with this economic siege was a situation that led to the decline of one of the most important Arab countries, and definitely probably the one that had achieved the highest levels of human development. Saddam, for all his ills and those that preceded him, had invested heavily in education, in health, in infrastructure, in industry. There was an economy in Iraq that really suffered out of the American aggression against the country that took place after the withdrawal from Kuwait. And it really did not have to happen that way, Daniel. But, of course, people, so much happened since then that people didn't even have time to take a pause and even think about that episode, because what came next was even much worse.
As we discussed in the final episode of the series, fading Soviet power had already severely undermined Arab anti-imperialist politics by the time Israel laid siege to Beirut in 1982. What did the USSR actually collapsing then mean for Arab politics, particularly the Arab revolutionary politics that we've dedicated Thawra to discussing? For example, would the first Gulf War have taken place had the Soviet Union still existed as a superpower?
Well, let's start by actually taking it a step back and looking at at what moment was the Soviet Union collapsing? In some ways, in the Middle East, let's remember that the Soviet Union had always been had a defensive posture in the region. The myth that it was like expanding in a big scale was just that. It was a myth. Yes, it had alliances with some important states after the West snubbed them, particularly Egypt. But, this was always a second option in the case of Egypt, not the first. It was able to establish partnerships with Iraq and Syria progressively. But again, these partnerships proved not to be of the sort that would allow these states to fully confront the bigger Western designs on their territories. So the situation we're seeing in this period is one where the Western states historically had been dominant. We had, after the Second World War, Britain's moment in the Middle East. The moment gets challenged in the 50s, partly through having this option of Soviet arming and to a lesser extent military funding and developmental funding. But this challenge does not achieve full victory. It achieves partial victories. We should never belittle the stories of independence, the great story of anti-colonialism, the fact that the British and the French were kicked out. But no one was able to end the presence of the main settler colony in the region at the time, which is, of course, Israeli state. And in fact, that settler colony expanded. Additionally, no one was able to fully secure their independence in the long run and to achieve a non-aligned path in the long run. Egypt, which fought really hard to achieve non-alignment, eventually ends up falling back into the Western camp, and it becomes under American influence to this day. Look, I mean, there's a genocide happening next door to Egypt. It's a threat to its national security and can't do anything because it's within this American entrapment. Same happens elsewhere. I mean, the Americans have the whole of the Gulf, as we mentioned earlier, and most importantly, of course, Saudi Arabia. Now, later on with the Second Gulf War, they take over Iraq, and they subsequently significantly weaken Syria. And this is just talking about the Mashrif. We haven't even touched the rest of the western part of the Arab region. So this is something that cannot be dismissed when we're looking at the regional map. It's not one in which the Soviets dominate. However, they did have agreements, they did have connections. For the most part, we see that towards the end of the Brezhnev years, their ability to really intervene strongly on behalf of the states that they were connected to and the national liberation projects that they were connected to is significantly weakened. And that is demonstrated fully during the siege of Beirut. You had a whole Arab capital being besieged. The Americans are supporting the effort covertly, and in many ways not covertly, like they're supporting the genocide now. It's really, they're pretending to be brokers, but they're also, everybody knows that they're behind the whole thing. But the Soviets were not able to act. That was a hallmark of the later Brezhnev period. They had these strategic disasters in zones that were important for the Soviet Union, and yet they did not intervene. Now, Andropov tries to counterbalance that later on, but his rule was very brief. And this is, again, we should remember, there was a crisis of Soviet leadership by the time we entered into the early 80s. Andropov did not last long enough to be able to intervene more forcefully, and he was an advocate of greater supplies being afforded to regional allies in the Middle East, better, armaments, and he would have definitely wanted a more proactive Soviet policy when it came to the siege of Beirut and other episodes. Again, had this happened 10 years earlier, in the early 70s, it would have been a major Cold War matter, besieging a major Arab capital like Beirut. So this tells you a lot about Soviet decline. What I'm trying to say is we had a whole decade where the Soviet Union was practically exiting in a way through lethargy and lack of initiative, but also through being totally distracted in Afghanistan. And in the meantime, you had this major American investment in developing Salafi jihadi ideology in Afghanistan to be able to bring down the Soviets there and drag them into the mud as much as possible. This is an important part of that story as well.
Good thing that didn't create any long-term blowback for the United States.
Absolutely, Daniel. I mean, I think our listeners know what you're talking about here. Little known man, by the name of Osama bin Laden is one of the products of this investment that we saw taking place. That the entirety of the Reagan administration was very involved in, and of course we see many of the figures then recycled back during the W years.
So there's this decade-long decline of Soviet power in the region, that the consequences of which we see very clearly with the 1982 Israeli siege of Beirut. What does the actual end of the Soviet Union mean for the Arab East?
Well, I mean, and again, decline is quite different than a complete end. So while the Soviet Union was around, even in the 80s, even in its weakest form, there was still this, you could still pretend that there was some counterbalancing force regionally and globally. And of course, you had little moments where the Soviets were trying to re-engage. There was in the 80s a defense treaty signed with South Yemen, for example, with the PDRY, and that's quite significant, like to have a defense treaty. That was a signal to Saudi Arabia, don't invade South Yemen. Signal, of course, to their American backers that this the Soviet Union will work hard to protect it. There were different attempts, to engage further with Syria and so on and so forth. But we see this decline happening in a big scale. We see it exhibiting itself in military failures of technology, especially with the Israelis, during the context of the 82 war. They shoot down 80 plus Syrian planes over the Beqa. This was a major disaster for Soviet technology. And yes, of course, the Soviets were pretending, well, if only we had like Russian pilots, it wouldn't have happened, and so on and so forth. But there was no question about it. American weaponry that was being provided, much higher quality when it came to radars, when it came to detection. So they had a lot of issues at this stage. But at the end of the day, they still existed. Once we get to the Gulf War, and of course, the Gulf War is another sign that's even worse for the Soviet Union. The run up to it, of course, Soviets were still around, yeah, and they have a relationship with Iraq, and it would have been in their interest to stop this from happening. But of course, in these Gorbachev years, there was a total lethargy going on at this stage. And the Soviets were not actually present in any meaningful way. But the minute you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, a new world has already emerged. By then, because the Gulf War, the collapse, everything else that had preceded that in the 1980s had already happened, and that meant that by the time we get to the 1990s. Really, we see just a major intensification of all the major aspects of American policy that they wanted to see in the region throughout. So we see a big expansion of American military buildup in the region. That's one macro theme. We also see economic changes of the kind that the Americans were pursuing globally. All the socialist experiments that we had referred to earlier, of course, we were focusing on political movements, but the political movements, all as we've seen throughout on Thawra and in the Dig, had different socialist experiments, and they led them in the region and under different banners and different iterations. All of these had to be reversed at this stage. Even non-socialist countries that had elements of the welfare state had to also roll back on this, including former American allies. Places like Jordan, for example. Now they were having the IMF knocking on their doors, being like, "Hi, do you want to be part of this order? If you do, then you have to privatize. You have to basically cut down on the state, reduce its size." This was happening in state after state after state. It was happening in states that had proclaimed socialist experiments like Syria. They end up, by the way, following a phased privatization approach, and the state increasingly withdraws from the economy, which then, by the way, provides the structural factors that eventually lead to the major revolts and revolutionary actions that later happened during the Arab Spring in Syria. That comes out of the crisis of the countryside that emerges out of a very intense 2 decades of neoliberalism coming into the country. And we can talk about that later, but you have this happening across the region. Of course, it's mirroring things that are happening globally. You can say really that the 1980s and the 1990s were the decades that paved the way for the Americanization of the region.
How had oil transformed the region at this point in the early 1990s? Once upon a time, OPEC, when people like the Saudi Red Sheikh Abdullah Tariqi were leading it, it had really embraced a third worldist vision to remake the world economy, not just for oil-producing states, but for the entire post-colonial world, a project that intersected in many ways with the goal of building a new international economic order, or NIEO. But oil-consuming countries, and this is something I discussed a while back in a 2-part interview with Giuliano Garavini, oil-consuming countries in the global north led the way in defeating that project. How, by the time of the first Gulf War, had oil reshaped the region, both in terms of the balance of power within the region, a balance that seems like it shifted decisively from places like Egypt to places like Saudi Arabia, and also the entire region's place in this U.S.-dominated world capitalist system?
Once again, we see that the major investment that had been undertaken in the 1950s and 60s was in heavy industry, was in the attempt to basically create a new future for places like Egypt, which had been traditionally the main centers of power in the region. You had the similar situation going on in Syria. Of course, they were also highlighting agriculture. You have a similar situation taking place in Iraq. Of course, in the Maghreb, we had this with Algeria. However, those attempts to create economies that were not oil dependent, but were very much modern economies that were focusing on industry and manufacturing had, by the 1980s and 90s, overall, they had failed. So we get to a situation. I'm not saying, by the way, that they completely failed. There's still industry in different places, but definitely heavy industries would not fare that well in the long run. Other types of industries do exist, but we do not witness a Promethean leap going on in the region that leads to a jump to like first world economy kind of levels of output. And there are reasons for that, by the way. People often make comparison between South Korea and Egypt, where they had similar levels in the 50s, but by the time you get to the 90s, it's a different story. And they often blame ISI and socialism for the different end results. But in actual reality, this has nothing to do with socialism or with South Korea being capitalist, because it was not actually particularly capitalist in the way it pursued this industrialization. What it had to do with was the Cold War necessities and what markets were open to these respective countries and what levels of investment were open to this. And of course, the great Egyptian economist who just passed away recently, Samir Amin, a great Marxist economist, always spoke about the monopoly on capital that had existed globally and that affected things like that. The monopoly on technology, which has affected also these outcomes in big ways. So we can go on and on about this theme, but the reality is that you end up with a situation where regionally, the main economies that succeed and that grow at a massive scale are the economies that are dependent on the production of oil, or in the case of Qatar, gas. So oil and gas, dominate. And by the 90s, they dominate not just economically, but politically as well. Already the political shift was happening. It was demonstrated actually after the 67 war. Nasser has to do a rapprochement with King Faisal, his arch enemy before and after 1967, because he needs to reconstruct. And he needs to reconstruct his army and his economy, and that requires money. Where's that money going to come from? By the way, first dose comes from Algeria. Big military dose comes from there. Boumediene intervenes and buys Soviet weapons for Egypt. People sometimes forget about that. But then the Saudis also carry out a program for all their countries in the area surrounding the Israelis. That does not come for free. It comes with influence. It comes with a big say in internal Arab politics for Saudi Arabia. And that only expands with the passage of time. Now, there's another phenomena that the political economist Adam Haniyeh talks about. He's a Marxist political economist working on the Middle East, and he talks about expansion of what he calls a Khaliji capital, Gulf capital, into the surrounding region. Because, of course, what you have when you have this kind of major oil and gas wealth, accumulation of wealth in economies where the population size is smaller, of course, and where the local economy cannot absorb the surplus, is that you have a lot of capital to export. Now, most of that capital gets actually exported and recycled into the West, into these countries, the dominant countries. So the United States, Britain. You find so many investment from the Gulf countries there. Sometimes it's done through actually buying military weaponry and hardware in a big scale. That keeps the military-industrial complex going. But in addition to that, you have investment happening in other zones, including now, and this is the new phenomena. There's major expansion in East Asia, but there's capital investment going on in the surrounding regional bloc, and that being the neighboring Arab states and other Middle Eastern states. With the neighboring Arab states, because the state sovereignty is weaker and because the economies are weaker now, that investment comes with greater political power than ever before. And it really means that everybody has to be careful when it comes to dealing with the Saudis and other Gulf powers because they've got enormous leverage over the local regional economies. Now, the other thing that they have leverage over, and this is provided by oil money, is of course what is to be done with the media and with the overall framing of events as well. Practically now, Daniel, every major Arab newspaper is owned by a Gulf outfit. Certainly the newspapers that are not state controlled, and this is quite a major phenomenon. Most of the satellite channels, same thing. And you only have local newspapers that are pan-Arab dailies. They're all controlled. Big satellite, pan-Arab satellite companies, same thing. So you do have, of course, also now major capitalists in local arenas having their own media empires. But really, on the pan-Arab level, the big dominant force that controls the narrative are different Gulf countries. They have competition between them, and in particular, there's a competition between the Qatari, supported entities and the Saudi / Emirati ones. But the pattern is one where these are the opinion is shaped in these places. Most of the writers depend on them. Most of the sources of funding for journalists, for artists, for intellectuals come from those spaces. So oil money plays a huge role in reshaping the region and in channeling the politics of the region in directions that would not have been desirable in the past.
Throughout this whole period, even as Palestinian civil resistance movements exploded, the PLO was continuing its long march toward a diplomatic settlement, culminating in the 1993 Oslo Accords, a so-called peace deal that in reality ultimately added up to a major capitulation, providing cover for intensified Israeli settlement of the territories occupied in 1967, for the construction of a powerful apartheid state governing the entirety of historic Palestine. And the PLO's openness to a Palestinian state on a small portion of historic Palestine in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, it had, as we've discussed, it had been a divisive topic all the way back to the mid-1970s when factions led by the PFLP formed a rejectionist front to oppose such a compromise. But from the perspective of a leader like Yasser Arafat, refusing a negotiated settlement risked losing everything, a repeat of 1948. Yet, as the Oslo Accords moved forward and heading into the Second Intifada that began in 2000, which is where we're going to begin the next part of the epilogue, a new sort of rejectionist front emerged in the form of Hamas and also Islamic Jihad, two religiously oriented groups founded in Gaza in the 1980s that, picking up the tradition of armed struggle, filled a vacuum created by the PLO's diplomatic turn. Lay out this giant, extremely consequential trajectory of the PLO at Oslo, and then how that whole process set the stage for the ascendance of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and what that all meant for the balance of forces within a Palestinian national movement, shifting from secular, nationalist, and leftist forces toward Islamic religious organizations.
Let's recall that the pathway to this idea of a negotiated settlement starts in the aftermath of the 73 war and the intensification of the attempts of the Americans to get separate deals on the part of Arab states with the state of Israel, and of course, throwing Palestinians under the bus in that process. In a way, by the way, what's happening now is a continuation of that. They're still insisting on this. They're just trying to expand these separate deals to include more and more Gulf states. And essentially, the objective is to achieve deals with everyone except for the Palestinians. And then, then you facilitate the colonization much more proactively. And of course, Hamas's response to that was seen very clearly in their operation that they termed Tawfan al-Aqsa. One of their declared objectives was to prevent the Abraham Accords from expanding. But really, the origins of the Abraham Accords and all of that goes back all the way to 1973. This idea that it's not one comprehensive agreement that includes everybody with the settler colony on the basis, of course, of that already a very limited arrangement offered by 242, the resolution 242, which is land for peace. The Americans essentially were saying the rule number one is everybody has to recognize the settler colony. The settler colony is here to stay. It's never going to disappear. Okay, so you recognize it, and but then in exchange you'll get whatever extra territory it occupied beyond what it had already occupied in 1948 back, except for the Palestinians. They will not get anything. So this was essentially what they were pursuing. Now, it worked with the Egyptians first. And the minute it worked with the Egyptians, and of course, Egypt was the most important because it's the biggest state bordering this settler colony and the one that has the greatest military capacity. Once it's neutralized, once it's out of the game as a result of the Camp David Accords, the PLO found itself in a very difficult position. Now, for a minute, Yasser Arafat thought that he could replace Egypt with Iran after the Iranian Revolution. And that's why, he developed this very close relationship with Khomeini. He tried very hard to prevent the Iran-Iraq war from happening. Even after it started, he tried very hard to carry out shuttle diplomacy between Baghdad and Tehran. The PLO, by the way, really, really tried its best to even integrate the Iranian revolutionary government into Arab summits. It even the PLO delegation brought with them an Iranian representative. And then it got reprimanded by the Gulf delegates. So you have these early Arab summits in the early 80s where the PLO is under a lot of heat for trying to do that. Now, it finds itself in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war and the failure as a result of this war to actually find a new counterbalancing force in the form of Iran. What it finds itself in is a dilemma because it has to choose. It either follows the official Arab line, which is support Iraq and Saddam Hussein, or you're screwed. Now, it follows that line, eventually, and it has to abandon the Iranian role, but at the same time, it's trying to signal to the Americans and the Europeans and these Western powers that it's really ready for a settlement. Arafat was smart, in a way, and completely oblivious in another way. He was very smart to realize that the Soviet option was disappearing. The Americans are coming in big time, and they're going to bring in this new formula and push it through. And unless the PLO demonstrates readiness to go along with the political process, then it will not be given any seat at the table. That was his reading, and he was correct in that regard. Now, the problem, though, at the same time, is He was playing a diplomatic game at a time where the national liberation struggle strategy was suffering as a result of this game. So the PLO's strength was always the people. And of course, once you end up with a situation where you're entering into this negotiations game, you have to cut off the structure that's supposed to be representing the people from the people it's representing, because you have to essentially undermine the power of the base within that structure and its ability to prevent negotiations. That was the dilemma that was faced by Arafat. As he was entering more and more into negotiations, he had to deactivate the representative capacity of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And he had to carry out deeply unpopular moves, because there were great suspicions that the Palestinian people had at the time around the sort of agreements that he was embarking on signing. Now, in the meantime, who benefits from this vacuum that's created by this detaching the PLO from its grassroots, and from detaching also its constituent parties from its grassroots, with their grassroots, particularly Fatah, is of course the newly emergent Islamic trend. Now, the Islamic trend has two major wings to it. One is Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad is a direct response to the Iranian Revolution. Its founder, Fath al-Shiqaqi, was a believer that the Iranian Revolution changes everything, that it offers a formula for struggle that demonstrates the power of religion in mobilizing the people. And he was saying, look, all of these leftists and other movements have been talking big talk about mobilization and revolution and so on. But at the end of the day, you have this great religious leader that carries out the task to its full logical conclusion. This reading of the Iranian Revolution that highlighted the role of Khomeini and that showed that he was much more important than smaller leftist forces and so on, was very important for influencing this line. The view that religion is a great mobilizer of the people. It allows for dedication, it allows for commitment to struggle at a higher level, it allows for the applying of principles that protect people from corruption, from all of these phenomena that at this stage of the PLO's life were seen as being prevalent in the Palestinian arena. Because of course, after the exit of Beirut, after everything that had happened, you had this bureaucratization that takes place within the PLO. You have different levels of corruption and so on. You have all sorts of issues that afflict the organization that are viewed, of course, very negatively within many Palestinian ranks. So this view that the Iranian Revolution changes everything influences the establishment of Islamic Jihad. And Islamic Jihad is very much focused on creating a very selective cadre, very focused towards the armed struggle, very focused towards what it views as a revolutionary pathway driven by Islamic principles. The creation of Islamic Jihad in the early 80s, in a way, leads to a crisis amongst the Muslim Brotherhood, because it's seen as essentially a split from the Muslim Brotherhood. These are Muslim brothers that had essentially come out and said, we are not happy with the way the movement has been, which is a movement that has not engaged in direct confrontations with the Israeli colonial structure. A movement that has focused far more on questions of what it calls social reform, which means spreading conservatism socially, social conservatism relating to piety, relating to modes of dress, modes of action, modes of prayer, so on and so forth. Commitment to rituals, adherence to Islamic principles, but all at that level. And you have with Islamic Jihad, you have this pressure of, where is resistance in this whole equation? We're losing cadres. That's the outlook. That was a conversation happening within the Muslim Brotherhood at the time. And they're like, look, we already had a major split in the late 50s that caused the loss of a lot of political power for the Muslim Brotherhood. Because that's how they saw Fatah. Many of the upper ranks of Fatah came from the Muslim Brotherhood. Initially, they were upset at the fact that it was refusing to carry out armed struggle against the Israeli settler colonial state, and that it was focusing on social reform. Now you have the repeat of this phenomena with Islamic Jihad. So you have this conversation within the Muslim Brotherhood that leads eventually to the establishment of Hamas. And that really takes place during the context of the First Intifada. So with the First Intifada, you have the entry of this new political formation into the Palestinian scene. And now you have two major Islamic parties. Of course, Muslim Brotherhood was always much, much larger than Islamic Jihad, and therefore it was able to, the formation that it created, its resistance wing, which is Hamas, becomes naturally much, much bigger than Islamic Jihad as well. But these two formations start exhibiting their power because they come out of a movement that always had a grounding. It was not the only movement. It was by no means the dominant movement. I mean, the natural size of something like the Muslim Brotherhood in the Palestinian political arena is 20 to 25%. That's naturally that's their base, but it's not a negligible base, and you can build a really mass movement. And in some regions, that size is even bigger. Particularly, we're talking about Gaza here. Now, coupled with actually the American created atmosphere around Afghanistan, which encouraged religious discourse. So on the one hand, you have this local phenomena, the Iranian Revolution, a regional phenomena that in many ways was very much opposed to the American empire, but that spread this idea of religion playing a major role in politics. It's coupled with an American-sponsored project of Salafi jihadism in Afghanistan that is Saudi-funded, that also essentially is making the same point, that religion is important in politics. So the regional atmosphere in the 80s is all about religion and politics. And you have key Palestinian arenas, including in Jordan, for example, where the Muslim Brotherhood at the time was not only functioning, but it was given extra, ability to maneuver and operate by the government itself. This was before the government decided to change course much later in the 2000s, of course, and turned against the Muslim Brotherhood. But up until, in the period around the 80s, they had a lot of ability to maneuver and operate. So you have multiple Arab arenas where they're able to do major recruitment. Of course, the entirety of the Gulf region, where you have lots of Palestinian emigres. And some of the key leaders in Hamas actually come from places like Kuwait, like Khalid Mashal, for example. He's a Palestinian that grew up in Kuwait. Others have different experiences, of course, and they play important roles. In Gaza, in particular, we have this phenomena. Somebody like Sinwar himself, who's a current leader, who is very much seen as someone who is behind the current overall strategy that's very much focused on armed operations. This political leader had been raised completely within a Gaza context, and he came out of the refugee experience in Gaza. But again, the First Intifada shapes him, and he comes out of this involvement in the early days of Hamas during the First Intifada.
That was the first part of our two-part epilogue to Thawra, the Dig series on 20th century Arab politics with Abdelrazak Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, if the emancipation of the working classes requires their fraternal concurrence, how are they to fulfill that great mission with a foreign policy in pursuit of criminal designs, playing upon national prejudices, and squandering in piratical wars the people's blood and treasure? While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram at thedigradio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it is on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, please also rate and review us with a glowing review and high rating. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. What really does that, though, is you telling other people to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.